Hello and welcome to another section of this complete Angular course. In this section, we are going to learn all about reactive forms. And let's start this section by understanding what is a reactive form and how to create a reactive form. So in the last section, we learned about template-driven forms. And there we learned that when we define a template-driven form, everything we do in the view template. But in a reactive form, we define the form and the form controls by writing some code. And that's what we are going to do in this section. We are going to create a form by writing some code. Now you might ask, why can't we use a simple HTML form in Angular and use it? Well, that's because using Angular, we create a single page application. So there should not be any submitting of form data to the server directly when the submit button in the form is clicked. But if we simply use an HTML form in our Angular application, in that case, when the submit button will be clicked in the form, that is going to submit the form by making a new request to the server. And when a new request to the server will be made, it will reload the page. And since using Angular we create a single page application, that means the whole Angular application will be reloaded. It will be restarted. That's why we need Angular's help to avoid the default behavior. And not only that, Angular also makes it easier to read the form control data and perform validation on the form controls and many more things when we use template driven approach or reactive form approach. Now we know that in Angular we can create forms using two approaches, either by using template driven approach or by using reactive form approach. And we have already talked about template driven approach in great detail in our previous section. Now in this section, we will learn how we can create forms and form controls using reactive form approach. Now, when we use reactive form approach, we define the structure of the form in the component class. That means we create the form model with form groups, form controls, and form arrays in the component class. And we also define the validation rules in the component class itself by writing some code. And then we need to bind the form group and form control which we have created in our component class to the HTML form in the view template. And we are going to understand this with an example. So the difference between a template driven form and a reactive form is that in a template driven form, we do most of the things in the view template itself. But in a reactive form, we create the form group and form control in the component class, and then we somehow synchronize it with the HTML form which we have defined in the view template. Now, the advantage of using a reactive form is that since we are going to define the form and form controls by writing some code, as a developer, we will have more control over how the form and the form control should be displayed. And using reactive form approach, creating dynamic controls also becomes easier. And when we use reactive form approach, unit testing is also easy. Now, the disadvantage of using reactive form is that since we are going to do most of the things by writing some code, it is not beginner friendly. Alright, so this was a high level overview of what a reactive form is and what are its advantages and disadvantages. Now, in order to work with reactive form, we need to import reactive form modules from Angular/Forms library. So when we work with template driven form, there we import forms module from the Angular/Forms library. But when we are working with reactive forms, in that case, we need to import reactive forms module from Angular/Forms. Now, let's go ahead and let's see how we can create a reactive form in Angular. To understand reactive forms, here I have created a brand new Angular project called Angular Reactive Form. Now, in this project, if I open this source folder, there if I go to this app folder, here I have not created any other component. We only have one component called app component. And in the HTML file of that app component, I have written some HTML. Basically, here I am defining a form using this form element. So keep in mind that even if in a reactive form approach, you're going to create a form by writing some code, still you need to define the form by using the form element of HTML. So here you see I'm using this form element, and inside this form element, I'm defining some input elements like first name, last name, email, then username, date of birth, gender, etc. And in order to design this HTML, in order to design this form, I've also written some CSS. So this HTML and this CSS you will find with the startup project, and the link for the startup project I have already provided in the description. Okay, so if I go to the web page, This is how the form will look like. There you will see that we have this first name input element, we have this last name input element, we have this email input element, username, date of birth, gender, street address, country, city, region, and postal code. So we are going to use this HTML form and we are going to make it a reactive form. Let's see how we can do that. So let's again go back to VS Code. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to work with reactive form, the first thing which we need to do is we need to go to app modules, and there we need to import reactive form module from Angular/forms. So this is the first step. Let's save this file here and let's close this app module.ts file. Now, in a reactive form, we define the form structure in the component class. Now, we have created the HTML form in the app component.html. So, in the app component class, we are going to create a form. So here, let's create a property. Let's call it reactive form. You can name it anything. You can also call it sign up form or registration form. But here I'm going to call it as reactive form. And the type of this reactive form is going to be form group. Now, in order to work with this form group, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. So let's write that import statement. Okay. All right. Now here we have this error because here we are not assigning anything to this reactive form property. So if you want, you can also go ahead and you can assign a new instance of form group to this property. Okay. There you need to pass an object. So you can do this assignment here, but instead of doing this assignment here, I would like to do this assignment inside the ng-on-init lifecycle hook when all the properties are initialized. Okay, so for now to avoid this error, what I will do is I'll go to tsconfig.json and there for now I will set this strict property to false. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to app component.ts and that error should be gone. Now we are going to assign this reactive form property with a new instance of form group in the ng-on-init lifecycle hook. For that, for this app component, we are going to implement on-init interface. And in order to use this on-init interface, we also need to import it from Angular/Go. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's implement ng-on-init interface, this ng-on-init lifecycle hook. And inside that, we are going to assign this reactive form with some value. So here, let's say this dot reactive form, and to this we want to assign an instance of form group. For that, first we need to use new keyword and then we need to call the constructor of form group, and to this constructor we need to pass an object, and inside this object we are going to specify what are the controls we want inside this form group, and we are going to specify it using key value pair. So for example, we want a first name form control. Okay, and to this first name we want to assign a form control. For that, again we will use new keyword and then we are going to call the constructor of form control. And again, in order to use this form control, we need to import it from Angular/forms. And here, let's move this import in this line and let's remove this import statement. All right, so in this way, inside this form group, we are creating a form control called first name. And to this form control, you can also pass the default value which you want to set for that form control. So currently I'll pass null. You can also pass empty string. Okay, so this will be the default value set for that form control. In the same way, let's also go ahead and let's define other form controls. For example, we also want a form control called last name. Then we also want a form control called email. We want a form control called username. We want a form control called date of birth. We want a form control called street address. So I'll simply call it as street. If I go to the web page, there you see we have this street. We also have this gender form control which we want, and we want country, city, region, and postal code. So let's also create a form control for gender. Then we have the form control for street. We want a form control for country. We want a form control for city. We want a form control for region. And finally, we also want a form control for postal code. So I'll simply call it as postal. So these are the form controls which we want in our form. Okay, so to create a form, we have used this form group class. We are calling its constructor. To that, we are passing an object. And inside that object, we are specifying what are the form controls we want for that form group. Now you might say, in template driven form approach, we had an object of type ngForm. But here, in order to create a reactive form, we are using form group. So why is that? Well, keep in mind that ngForm is also a type of form group. Okay, so when we import forms module from Angular/forms, then whenever it finds a form in the Angular application, it will automatically make it as template driven form. We don't need to explicitly use ngForm on that form. Okay, but still that ngForm is of type form group. That's because a form is nothing but it is a collection of form controls. And ngForm is also storing a collection of form controls. Right. So ngForm is also a form group. In the same way, when we are using reactive form approach, there also we are creating a form group, and in that form group, we have a collection of form controls. All right, now here we have defined the form structure. Now we need to connect this form, this reactive form, this form group which we have created here to the HTML form which we have defined in our view template. So basically to this form, we need to connect this reactive form. For that, on this form element, we need to use a directive, and that directive is form group. And this G should be caps here. And to this form group directive, we want to assign this reactive form property. So here we need to do property binding. For that, we will wrap this form group directive within square brackets like this. And then to this, we will assign this property, this reactive form property. And in this way, now this HTML form is connected with this reactive form group. And we also need to connect these controls to the respective controls in this HTML form. So for example, we need to connect this first name input element to this first name form control. Now, how are we going to do that? For that, on each of these form controls, we need to use another directive called form control name. And to this form control name, we need to assign the form control which we want this input element to connect to. In this case, we want this input element to be connected to this first name form control. So let's copy this first name from here and let's assign it here. Now here notice that we are not doing any property binding. So this value will be considered as string value. But if we do property binding like this, in that case, Angular will think that this first name is some TypeScript expression, right? So when we are doing property binding like this on the directive, then we need to wrap this value within single quotes, because here we need to specify a string value. Keep this point in mind. But here I will not do property binding. I'll simply pass this first name as a string value to this form control name, and it should be form control name. And let's go ahead and let's do the same thing on other input elements. So we want to connect this last name input element to the last name form control. So here we will pass last name. So this last name, we have a form control inside this form group. Then we also have this email form control. So here in this next line, we want to connect this email input element to email form control. Then we want to connect this username input element to username form control. Let's do the same thing for other form controls. Then here for the gender, for each of these genders, we want to connect it to gender form control. So I'll remove this checked from here. And here we want to connect this form control, this radio button, to gender form control. Let's do the same thing on other radio buttons. And here we don't need this name attribute now. Okay, so I'll remove it from here. Then let's scroll down. Here we have this drop down list. So we want to connect this drop down list to country form control. We want to connect the street address to street form control. Then let's scroll down. We want to connect the city input element to city form control. We want to connect this region input element to region form control. And we want to assign this postal code input element to postal form control. Okay, so in this way, using this form control name directive, we are connecting each of the form controls to the form control which we have defined inside this form group. And in order to connect this form group to the form, on that form, we are using form group directive. So now if we go to the web page, now this form is no more just a HTML form. Now it is a reactive form. Now, if you want to set some default value for some of the fields of this form, for example, let's say for this gender, I want to set the default value as male. And for the country, I want to set the default value as India. For that, let's go back to VS Code. And if I scroll down, here we have the gender radio button. This should be male. So I want to make this M in caps. And here also, let's make this P in caps. All right, so if you notice for each of the radio buttons, currently we are not providing any value attribute, right? So let's go ahead and let's provide a value attribute here. So for the male radio button, the value should be male. For the female radio button, the value should be female. And for this prefer not to say radio button, let's say the value should be other. And based on this value, we can set a default value. So for example, we want to make this input element checked by default. So we are going to pass this value to the gender control inside this form group. So here we have this gender control. Currently, for this gender control, we are passing the default value as null, but now we want to pass the default value as male. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now you will notice that by default, male is selected. In the same way, for this country dropdown, we want the default value to be India. So let's go back, and here we have our country control. There, let's specify the default value as India. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now you'll notice that India is selected by default. So in this way, you can also set a default value for your form controls. Now, when this form will be submitted, as we learned in the template-driven form approach, when a form gets submitted, Angular raises an event called ng-submit. And we can listen to that ng-submit event, and whenever the form will be submitted, we can do something. So when this button will be clicked, since the type of this button, so if I go to appcomponent.html, if I scroll down, currently the type is button, but here let's set it to submit. Okay, so when the type is submit and when the button will be clicked, it is going to submit the form. And when the form will be submitted, in that case, ng submit event will happen. And we can listen to that ng submit event on this form itself, because when the submit button will be clicked, the complete form will be submitted. So the ng submit event will happen on the form. And we are listening to that ng submit event. And when this ng submit event happens, we want to execute some code. So here, to this ng submit event, let's pass a method. Let's say on form submitted. And inside this on form submitted method, let's go ahead and let's write some logic. So let me copy this method name from here in the component class. Let's create that method. So after this ng on init, let's go ahead and let's create this method. And in there, I'm simply going to use console.log statement. And what do I want to log here? I want to log this reactive form property. So for that, I'll simply say this dot reactive form. So when we were using template driven approach, there what we had to do is on the form, we had to use a template reference variable. And to that template reference variable, we assigned ngForm object. And then we were accessing that template reference variable using viewChild decorator, and then we were logging that template reference variable. But here we don't need to do anything like that. Here we can simply go ahead and log this reactive form property, because it is this reactive form property which is storing our form, right? So with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me open developer console. Let's go to console tab. Let me clear everything. And when I click on the submit button, you will notice that an object of type form group has been logged. If I expand this form group object, there we should have controls property. And if I expand this controls property, you will see that we have all our controls which we have defined inside that form group. So for example, city, country, date of birth, email, first name, gender, last name, postal, region, street, username, etc. And we should also have a value property. So here we have our value property. If I expand this value property, this is an object, and in that object, with the form control name, we have a property name, and the value for these properties is the value which we have entered in that form control. So currently for these form controls, we have not entered any value, but for those form controls where we have a default value, for example, for this gender and for this country form control, you will notice that the default values are already set. For the gender, male is set, and for the country, India is set. So we can use this value property to retrieve the value of each form control from this form. Let me clear the console here. Let's go ahead and let's enter some value in these fields. And now when I click on this submit button, again, this form group has been logged. If I expand this, and if I expand the value property here, you will notice that the values which we have entered in these form controls, that has been assigned here. And in this form group, you will also find other properties. For example, we have this invalid and valid property, which tells us whether the form is valid or not. We have this dirty property, which tells us whether the form is dirty or not. Then we also have this untouched property, and we should also have a touched property. So here we have the touched property, which tells us whether any form control in this form has been touched or not. So the structure of this form group object is very similar to the structure of the ng form object, which we learned about in the template driven form approach. Then for each of these form controls, in this controls property, this controls property is an object, and in that object, for each of these form controls, a property will be created with the form control name, and to that property, the form control object will be assigned. So for example, if I expand any one of these form controls, let's say first name, there you will see the details related to that form control. For example, what is the status of that first name form control? It is valid. Whether the form controls value has changed or not. If it is changed, in that case, this pristine will be false and this dirty will be true. But if it has not changed, in that case, this pristine will be true and dirty will be false. Then we have this value property, which stores the value which we have entered inside this form control. So in this first name form control, we entered this value John, and that value you can see it is assigned to this value property. All right. So in this way, using this form group or using this form control object, we can retrieve the value which the user has entered inside the form control. And if you want to retrieve the value of all of the form controls from the given form, in that case, you can use the value property of form group. All right, so in this lecture, we learned how we can create a reactive form. Now, in the next lecture, let's learn how we can do validation on a reactive form. In the last lecture, we learned what is a reactive form and how we can create a reactive form. Now, in this lecture, let's learn how we can perform validation on the form controls of a reactive form. So, in the last lecture, we created this form using reactive form approach. Now, currently, on none of these form controls, any validator has been added. So, by default, all these form controls will be valid. And when all the form controls are valid, in that case, the valid property of the form group will be true. So if I scroll down here, you will notice that the valid property of this form group is true and the invalid property of this form group is false. And if we check this valid property on form control level also, for that, in the form group, we have this controls property, which is an object. And in that controls object, for each of these form controls, we have a property with a form control name, and it is storing an instance of form control. So if I expand one of the form controls here, for example, first name, there also you will notice that the valid property on that form control is set to true and the invalid property is false. That's because by default, each form control in a form is valid. And when each form control in a form is valid, in that case, the complete form will be valid. Now what we are going to do is, we are going to use some validators on some of the form controls. For that, let's go back to VS Code. Now, in case of a template-driven form, in order to add validation, we used to use HTML attributes, like for example, required. So in that case, it will make this form control a required field. In the same way, we also used another attribute called email on the email field. In that case, in that field, we needed to provide a valid email address. So we used to do the validation in the HTML itself in case of a template-driven form. But now, in case of a reactive form, we don't add these HTML attribute validators on the form element. Instead, we add the validators on the form controls which we are defining inside this form group. So for example, let's say this first name, last name, and email, it should be a required field. To set that validator, all we have to do is, to the constructor of this form control, we can pass another optional argument. And here we need to use validators. So this validators, it is provided by this Angular/forms. So let's import that. And on that validators, we have a list of validators. For example, we have this email validator, this max validator, this max length validator, min validator, and we also have this required validator. And when we use this required validator, it makes that form control a required field. So if I hover over this required validator, you will see that it is going to make that field a required field. So user must enter a non-empty value in that field. Okay, let's go ahead and let's use the same validator on last name and email as well. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let me clear the console. And now when I click on this submit button, this form group has been logged. And if we go to the valid property now, you will see that it is false and invalid is true. Because now this first name, last name, and email, these are required fields, but we have not entered any value in these form controls. So these form controls are currently invalid because they do not contain a valid value. And as we learned, if any one form control in a form is invalid, in that case, the complete form is invalid. And that's why here the valid property is false and invalid property is true. Let's check this valid property on the form control level as well. So if I expand this controls object, let's expand this first name object. And there also, if I go, you will see that this valid is false and invalid is true. Same will be the case with last name. So if I expand this last name control, there also the valid is false and invalid is true. And same thing should be there on the email field as well. So this email field is also currently invalid because on this we have added a required attribute. So here the valid is false and invalid is true. So keep in mind that if any form control in a form is invalid, in that case, the complete form will be invalid. And if we are using a validator on any of the form control, then in that case, in that form control, we must provide a valid data. We must enter some valid input in that form control. Then only this valid property will be true and invalid will be false. So now if I go ahead and if I enter some valid value, and let's clear the console. And now when I click on the submit button, now we are providing a valid value for each of the required fields. Okay, when I click on the submit button, if I expand this form group now you will notice that the valid is true and invalid is false because now each of the form controls contains a valid value. And if we check it at the control level also, for example, for the first name, there also you will see that the valid is true and invalid is false, because this first name is a required field, so its value must be non-empty, and currently it is non-empty. That's why this field has a valid value, and when the form control has a valid value, its valid property will be true and invalid property will be false. And when all the form controls in the form has a valid value, the complete form will be also valid. All right. Now, here we have entered a proper email address, but let's say I enter some invalid email address, something like this. Let me clear the console again. And now when I click on this submit button, still you will notice that this valid is true and invalid is false. And if I expand the controls, and there if I expand this email control, there also the valid is true and invalid is false. Now here we are not entering any valid email address, but on this email address we have only used the required validator. So this form control will only check if in this field we have a non-empty data or not. If we have non-empty data in this form control, in that case that form will be valid. But what we also want to check is if the user has entered a valid email or not. For that we can use another validator. So let's go back to VS Code. And on this email field, it should be required, and user should also provide a valid email address in this field. So we also want to use another validator here called email. Now when we want to use multiple validators on a form control, in that case we need to use an array, and inside that array we need to specify the validators which we want to use. So on the email field we want to use this required validator, and we also want to use the email validator. For that, again, first we need to access these validators, and on that we will have a validator called email. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Okay, and let's enter some data in these form controls. And here in the email, let me enter some invalid email address. And let's click on the submit button. Now you will notice that the valid is false and invalid is true, because now in the email field we are providing some data, but that data is not a proper email address. So the email validator will check whether this data it is a valid email or not. Since it is not a valid email, the validation will fail, and in that case this valid property on the form control as well as on the form level will be false, because here one of the form controls has invalid data, so the complete form will be invalid. And we can also check it on the control level. If I expand this email form control, there also you will see that the valid property is false and invalid property is true. And we can also see what validation error has occurred on this form control. For that we can use this errors property. So here you can see in the errors property you will notice that we have an error on email. So this email is basically a validation error code. For each validator we have a validation error code, and this email is the validation error code for email validator. So if the email validator fails, in that case it is going to return an error code email, and that will be set here for this errors property. Okay, but if I go ahead and if I enter a valid email address, let me clear the console. And now when I click on the submit button, now you will notice that the valid is true and invalid is false. So this is on the form level, and on the control level also. If I expand this email, there also you will notice that now valid is true and invalid is false, and this error object should be null. So it means that now on this email form control there is no error. If there would have been any error, in that case this errors property will have an object, and in that object you can see the error code. Now let's also talk about the state of a form. So let me clear the console here. Let's refresh the page and let's go to this element section. And there I'll expand this app root, this sections. In there we have this form, and in there we have this input box of type text, and name here is first name. So you can see form control name is first name, and we also have this last name input element where the form control name is last name. So initially you will see that on these form controls, Angular is automatically adding a CSS class. And in that CSS class, you will see CSS classes like ng-untouched, ng-pristine, and ng-invalid. That's because initially when the form loads for the first time, none of its form controls will be touched. Okay, in that case, ng-untouched CSS class will be added. Then none of its form controls is dirty. So a form control will be dirty when the form control value changes. So since none of the form controls is dirty, you will notice that ng pristine CSS class has been added. And on this form control, we have used a required validator. That means in this form control, we must enter a non-empty value. But currently in this form control, we have an empty value. So this form control does not contain a valid value. For that, this ng invalid CSS class has been added by Angular. So in this way, this is the state of this form control. Now, when I click inside this form control, inside this first name form control, and when I click outside, this form control will be touched. In that case, this ng untouched will be removed and ng touched CSS class will be added. Let me show you that. So just notice what happens here on this first name input element. Currently, ng untouched CSS class has been added, but if I go ahead and if I touch this form control, so if I click inside it and then outside, you will notice that ng untouched has been removed and ng touched has been added. In the same way, if I enter some value inside this form control, inside this first name form control, the value will change in this form control. So this ng pristine will be removed and ng dirty will be added. For example, if I enter John, you will notice that ng pristine has been removed and ng dirty has been added. And now this form control also contains a valid value. It does not contain an empty value. So ng invalid has been removed and ng valid has been added. And same is the case for all the form controls. Okay, on this last name form control also, you will notice that initially ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng invalid CSS class has been added because this form control is not touched yet, its value has not changed, and currently it does not contain a valid value. It contains an empty string. So that empty value is not a valid value for this last name form control because it is a required field. That's why you will see ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng valid. But as soon as I click inside this form control and I click outside, ng untouched has been removed, ng touched has been added. If I enter some value in this field, then you will notice that ng dirty has been added and ng pristine has been removed and ng valid has been added and ng invalid has been removed. So using these CSS classes, we can get the state of the form control. Now keep in mind that if any one form control in the form is touched, that means the complete form is touched. If any one form control is dirty, that means the complete form is dirty. And if any one form control has an invalid value, that means the complete form is invalid. Okay. Now we can make use of these states, these CSS classes for our own purpose. For example, let's say if a form control does not contain a valid value and if it is touched, in that case, we want to show a red border around the form. And for that, we can make use of the CSS classes. So let's say if the form control does not contain a valid value, in that case, on that form control, ng invalid CSS class will be added, right? So let's go back to VS Code and let's go to app component.css and there, let's scroll down. All right. And here, what we are going to do is we are going to create a CSS class and the CSS class name should be ng invalid. Okay, so if on any form control we have this CSS class ng invalid, in that case we want to set its border. We want to set its border to red. It should be 2 pixel and solid. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And here you will notice that instead of adding the red border on the form controls, it has added the red border on the form. Now here you might ask why we don't have the red border on the form controls, because currently this first name, last name and email does not contain a valid value. So these are also invalid fields. Then we should have a red border around these fields also. That's because if I scroll up, somewhere we are setting the border for those input elements. Okay, so here you see we are setting the border for those input elements. So this border is overriding the border which we are trying to set using ng invalid CSS class. So I will comment this line here. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now you will also see the red border around all invalid form controls. Now we don't want to show the red border around form. We only want to show red border around form controls, around invalid form controls. So let's go back and let's specify that. So if the form control is of type input, okay, and on that, if we have this ng invalid CSS class added, then only we want to show the red border. With this, if we save the changes, if we go back to the web page, now you will notice that now that red border is only being shown on the invalid form controls. Now, initially, I don't want to show this red border around invalid form controls. Initially, when the page loads, this red border should not be there. If the user has touched that form control, that means if the user has clicked inside the form control, but he has not entered a valid value and then he clicks somewhere outside, at that time only we want to show the red border around that form control. For that, if the form control is touched, on that ng touched CSS class will be added, right? So we are also going to make use of that CSS class. So here let's say if the form control is of type input, on that form control, if this ng invalid CSS class is added and also the ng touched CSS class is added, then only we want to show this red border. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And initially you will not see red border around these form controls, but if I click inside this form control will be touched. And if I don't enter any value inside this form control, in that case it will have an invalid value. So in that case ng touched and ng invalid CSS class will be added on that form control. Now when I click outside, now you will notice that now it has a red border around it because this form control is touched and it does not contain a valid value. Same will be the case with last name and email. So this is how we can make use of these CSS classes which gets added on each of the form controls. Okay, we can make use of these CSS classes. So you see, currently on this first name form control, it has ng invalid CSS class added and also ng touched CSS class added. And it is of type input. And that's why this red border is around this form control. But if I enter some valid value here, this ng invalid will be removed. So let's say John. So ng invalid has been removed. And since ng invalid has been removed, that red border has also been removed. Okay. So here, in order to add validators in a reactive form to this form control, we need to pass a second argument. If we want to use only one validator, then we can simply pass the validator name like we are doing here for the first name and last name. But if we want to pass multiple validators, we need to pass an array. And inside that array, we can specify the validators which we want to use on that form control. Now let's see what are the other form controls which is available on this validators object. For that, let's go to angular.io website. There, let's go to docs. Let's go to references and let's go to API references and let's search for validators. So here we have the validators and here you can see all the validators which is available on a reactive form. If I click on see more, you'll also see how to use those validators and what that validator does. So for example, we also have this main validator and using this validator, we can set in a form control what is the minimum number of values allowed. Similarly, we will have a validator called max, which tells what is the maximum number of value, what is the maximum number of numeric value which is allowed in that form control. And in the same way, we have other form controls as well. For example, required, and we understood it with an example. Then we have required true, we have this email validator, and we have other validators as well, like min length. So for example, on the first name control, if you want to set what is the minimum number of characters required in a name, you can use this min length validator. Okay, so you can go through this document to check what are all the validators available for a reactive form in Angular. Now we will learn more about validators in our coming lectures, and there we will also see how we can display a custom validation error message in our form whenever form control contains an invalid value. In the last lecture, we learned how to add validation on a reactive form in Angular. Now, in this lecture, let's learn how we can show a validation error message to the user if the user has not entered a valid value in a form control. So currently, if we don't enter a valid value in this first name, last name or email field, in that case, it is showing a red border around those form controls. But along with showing red borders around the form control, we also want to show what validation error has occurred on that particular form control. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go to VS Code and let's go to app-component.html file. There, here we are displaying this first name input element. After that, I'm going to add a small element here. And here, let's say first name is a required field. And let's also use an asterisk before this. Okay, so this is the validation error message we want to show to the user if the user does not enter a value in the first name input field. And for the small element, I have also added some CSS. So if I go to app-component.css and if I scroll up, here you see for the small element, we are setting some CSS styles. For example, the text color will be displayed in red and the font weight will be bold. So if I save the changes and if we go to the web page, you will notice that this error message is being displayed here. Now here, even if I enter a valid value in this first name field, then also this error message will be displayed. But we only want to display this error message if the user has not entered a valid value in this field. For that, what we need to do is, if I submit the form here, we need to access this first name field, this first name control from this controls property, and this first name control will have a valid property. Okay, so currently it is true because we have entered some value in this first name field. So it contains a valid value. That's why this valid is true. But if the user has not entered a valid value in this field, in that case, this valid property will be false. And when this valid property of this first name control is false, then only we want to show this validation error message. Now, how are we going to do that? For that, we need to access this valid property of this first name form control. And to access the valid property of the first name form control, first we will have to access this first name form control. And to access this first name form control, on this form group, we will have a method called get. And using that method, we can access a form control from a form group. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go back to VS Code. And as I mentioned, we want to display this error message, this small element in the web page, only if the form control has an invalid value. So first of all, on this one, we are going to use ngIf directive. And using this ngIf directive, we are going to render this small element in the DOM if the valid property of first name form control is true. If it is false, then we are not going to render this small element in the DOM. For that, I'm using this ngIf directive. Now to this ngIf directive, we need to assign a TypeScript expression which will return a Boolean value. For that, we want to access the first name form control from this reactive form group. So this reactive form property, we are defining this reactive form property in our app component.ts, and it is storing a form group. So on that property, what we are going to do is, so here to this ngIf directive, let's assign that property. And on that property, let's call a get method. And to this get method, we need to pass a string value. Now, what do we need to pass here? We need to pass the name of the form control. So for this input element, for this first name input element, the form control name is first name. So we need to pass this name as a string value to this get method. And it will return us the first name form control from this reactive form group. And in that form control, we will have a valid and invalid property. So here I'm going to use invalid property. So if this invalid property is true, so it should be invalid. So if this invalid property is true, in that case, this small element will be rendered in the web page. But if this invalid property is false, in that case, this small element, it will not get rendered in the web page. Okay, let's see that in action. So let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And you will notice that initially That small element is rendered in the web page, so we can see the error message here. But if I go ahead and if I enter a valid value in this field, let's say John, now that error message is gone. Now what I also want is, initially when the page loads, that time this error message should not be displayed. Only if the user has touched this first name form control, and if he has not entered a valid value and then he clicks somewhere outside, that time only we want to show this error message to the user. So we are also going to use the touched property of form control. So let's go back to VS Code and let me move this error message in a separate line so that it will be more readable. And here we are also going to use AND operator. Okay, and again let me copy this expression from here. So again, on the reactive form, we are going to call the get method. We are going to get access to this first name control, and in that first name control we are going to check if that control is touched or not, like this. Okay, so we are checking two conditions now. The first condition we are checking is if the first name form control is invalid, and if it is touched, then only we want to render this small element in the DOM. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Now, initially, that error message is not being displayed. If I click inside this first name form control, and if I don't enter a valid value, and if I click outside, now that error message is being displayed here. But if I go ahead and if I enter a valid value, let's say John, that error message is gone. And we want to do the same thing for last name and email as well. So again, let's go back to VS Code. Let me copy this HTML from here, and let's also paste it after this last name input element. And there we will say last name is a required field. And here we want to access the last name form control. And for the last name form control, the form control name is last name. So let's pass this name to this get method. So instead of first name, we are going to pass last name. And here also, we are going to pass last name. Okay, let's do the same thing for email as well. So let's scroll down. Here we have the email field. Let's paste this small element there. And here we will say entered email is not valid. Okay, and to this get method, now we need to pass the form control name. And here the form control name is email. So let's pass this form control name. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now if I click inside this first name input element, and if I don't enter any value, and if I click outside, you can see this error message. First name is a required field. Same thing will happen for last name and email. But if we go ahead and if we enter a valid value in these fields, then those error messages will be gone. Okay. Now what we also want is, if any of the form control does not contain a valid value, then we want to disable this submit button. The submit button should be enabled. That means the user should be able to submit the form only if all the form controls contains a valid value. So if I submit this form now, you will notice that on the form level also we have this valid property and invalid property. So we want to make use of this valid property or invalid property of this form group in order to enable or disable this submit button. So if the form is valid, that means all the form controls of this form contains a valid value, then this submit button will be enabled. Otherwise, if any one form control contains an invalid value, this submit button should not be enabled. It should be disabled. For that, let's go to VS Code and let's scroll down. So here we have our submit button. On this submit button, I'm going to use this disabled attribute. And here I'm going to do property binding. Now, where are we storing our form group? We are storing it inside this reactive form property. So this reactive form property, it is going to store the form group. And from that form group, we want to access its valid property. So here let's say reactive form dot valid. So if this expression returns true, that means the form is valid. That means none of its form control contains an invalid value. In that case, we want to enable the submit button. So here we will use not operator. You can also use invalid property here. In that case, you will not have to use this not operator. But since I'm using this valid property, if this valid property returns true, we want to enable the submit button. But if it returns false, then only we want to disable the submit button. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And currently, if I click on this submit button, you will not see that form group logged here because the form is not getting submitted. Only after I enter a valid value in all the required fields, and when I click on this submit button now, all the controls here now has a valid value. So now this submit button should be enabled, and now it should allow us to submit the form. And you can see now the form is submitted and the form group object has been logged here. But if any one form control contains an invalid value, in that case, the complete form will be invalid. And in that case, this submit button should not be enabled. So when I click on this submit button, it should not submit the form and we should not see form group object logged here. So I have already clicked on this submit button 3 times, but it is not submitting the form and it is not logging that form group object in the console. In this lecture, let's learn how we can group some of the form controls together in a reactive form. So currently, all these form controls are part of a single form group, which is representing this complete form. So in this form group, we have this controls property. And in that controls property, you can see all the form controls which we have in this form. Now, what we want is, we want to group some of the form controls together. For example, in this form, we have some form controls related to address. For example, the street address, country, city, region, and postal code. So I want to group these form controls together into a form group. And I want to call that form group address. Let's see how we can do that. So in a reactive form, we can group form controls together using 3 simple steps. In the first step, let's go to appcomponent.ts. There, we are creating a form group. We are calling it reactive form. In that form group, we have all these form controls. Now, I want to group some of the form controls together. So basically, I want to group the street, country, city, region, and postal code form controls together. For that, after this gender property, I'm going to create a new property. I'll call it address. And this property is going to be of type form group. All these form controls are of type form control. But here we are creating a form group. So this address property, it is going to store a form group. And to this address property, in order to assign a form group, we need to create an instance of form group class. For that, we can use this new keyword. And after that, we can call the constructor of form group. And to this constructor, again, we need to pass an object like this. And inside this object, we can create other form controls. So inside this form group, we want to have these form controls, the street, country, city, region, and postal code form control. So I'll cut it from here and let's paste it inside this object which we are passing to this form group constructor. So now these form controls are basically part of this address form group. And this address form group, it is a part of reactive form group. So this is the first step. In the second step, what we need to do is the form controls which we are defining in the HTML. So here we have the address related form groups like street address, city, we have this country drop down, then we also have this region input element and postal code input element. So these form controls should be present inside the address form group. So what we need to do is we need to wrap these form controls inside a container div. And I'm already doing that. So if you see here, we have this div, and inside this div, we have all the address related form controls. So I am already grouping them inside a container element. But if your form controls which you want to group, it is not present inside a single container, then first you need to create a container and you need to move all the form controls inside that container which you want to group together. Okay, so that will be the second step. And in the third step, on this container div, you need to use a directive called FormGroup name. And to this FormGroup name directive, you need to assign the form group which you have created. So here we have created this address form group. Okay, and this address form group is present inside this reactive form group. So here in the HTML, we have this reactive form group. You see, we have this reactive form group, and in that form group, we also have this new form group. And to this form group name, we need to assign that form group name which we have created. We are calling it address. This is the third step. So if I save the changes now, and if we go to the web page, let me clear everything here and let me enter value for the required fields. Otherwise, the submit button will not be enabled. And now when I click on this submit button, this form group has been logged here. If I expand this form group and if I expand this controls, now you will see that we have a new property called address, which is a form group. And in that form group, we have other controls, which we can see inside this controls property of that address form group. So if I expand this controls property now, there we have the city, country, postal region, and street form controls. So in this way, we can group form controls together into a single form group. And also, if I check the value property of this form group, which is at the top, which is representing our form. So we have that value property here. So if I expand this value property now, there you will see we have first name, last name, username, gender, and email form controls and their values which we have entered. And then we have this address property. And in that address property, we have other form controls like city, country, postal, region, and street. So now, in order to read the value of these form controls, this street, city, country, region, and postal code form control, first we will have to access the value property of this form group. In that value property, we will have to access the address property. And from that address property, we can read the value of these form controls. Okay. Now let's do one more thing. Let's go ahead and let's add the required validator on this street address, this city, country, and postal code. For that, let's go to VS Code and let's go to app component.ts. And now to this one, we are going to make it required field. For that, we need to use validators. And on that validators, we have the required validator. Let's do the same thing for country, city, and postal code. So here also, we will use the required validator. And on the postal code also, we will use the required validator. Okay, so let's say city and region is not required, it is optional. With this, let's save the changes. And now what we want is, we also want to display an error message if the user does not provide a valid value in the street, country, and postal code field. So let's go to appcomponent.html. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to copy this small element from here, this small HTML, and let's add it on street 1 address. So here we are displaying the street address. After that, I'm going to add this small element, and there let's say street is a required field. And we want to show this error message only when the street form control is invalid and if it is touched. So to this get method, we need to pass the name of the form control. Now, if I simply pass street here, which is the name of the form control, like this, and here also. So if I go back to appcomponent.ts, the name of the form control is street, and we are passing it to this get method. If I save the changes now, and if we go to the web page, you will notice that we have an error, and it says cannot read properties of null when we are trying to read this invalid property. So for some reason, this expression here, it is returning null. Now it is returning null because the street property is no more present inside the value property of the top form group. So this reactive form, it will have a value property, and in that value property, You see, we do not have any street property, right? That street property is present inside this address property now. So in order to access this street property, we need to access it on this address property of this reactive form group. So here, instead of saying street, we need to say address.street. So address is an object, which is a property of the value object. And in that address, we have the street property. Here also, we need to do the same thing, address.street. Now, if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, now that error is gone. And if I click inside the street address and if I do not enter any value, you will see this error message. Street address is a required field. Let's do the same thing for postal code and country. So I'll copy this HTML from here and let's add it after this drop down. And here let's say country is a required field. And here we need to pass the form control name. So it will be address.country. And here also it should be address.country. And let's do the same thing for postal code as well. So here we are displaying the postal code. After that, let's add this small element. And here let's say address.postal. So the name of the form control is postal. Same thing let's do here. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now if I click inside this postal code and if I don't enter any value, you will see that we have this error message. Street address is a required field. But if I enter a valid value inside this, then that error is gone. So let's enter some details in these fields. And now when I click on this submit button, this form group has been logged. If I expand this and if I go to the value property of this form group, so here we have the value property. There you will see all the values have been assigned. And for the address, if I expand this address property, there city, country, postal code, region, and street has been assigned. Okay, so this is how we can group some of the form controls together in a reactive form. In this lecture, you will learn what is a form array and how to create and use a form array in a reactive form. A form array is a way to manage a collection of form controls in Angular. The form control can be a form group, form control, or another form array. Now, we have learned that we can also create a collection of form controls by using form group. So, how is form array different from form group? Let's try to understand that. So, in Angular, we can group form controls in two ways, either using form group or by using form array. Now, the difference between form group and form array is in the way they create the collection. Form group stores the form controls in the form of key value pair in an object. On the other hand, form array stores the form control as an element of an array. So it creates an array and in that array we will have form controls. Now a form control can be a form group, a form control or a form array. Let's understand form array with an example. So here we are creating a reactive form using this form group. And in this form group we have form controls and we also have a form group. In the same way, in a form group, we can also have form array. So here I'm going to create a form array. For that, let's create a property. Let's call it maybe skills. And to this, we are going to assign an instance of form array. Now, in order to use this form array, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. Now, when we create a form group, there we pass an object, right? So here we are passing an object, and here also when we are creating this address form group, there also we are passing an object. But when we create a form array, there instead of passing an object, we pass an array. And inside this array, we define our form controls. So for example, here I'm going to create a form control. For that, I can create an instance of form control. And initially, let's pass the default value as null. And it should be form control. All right. Now, somehow we need to bind this form control with a form element in the HTML. So in the HTML, I'm going to create an input element. So before this submit button, let me go ahead and let me add a div. And in that div, I'm going to create an input element. And this input element, it is going to be of type text. Now on this div, I also want to use a CSS class. So I want to use this CSS class. Scroll down and let's add it on that div. All right. Now this div here, it is container div. So it is containing this input element. And inside this div only, we want to display all the form controls of the form array. So currently in this skills form array, we have only one form control. Now let me go ahead and let me add two more form controls here. So I'll copy this line and let me paste it two more times. Okay. So now we have three form controls inside this form array, and we want to display all these three form controls inside this div. So this div is going to be the container div for all the form controls available inside the form array. Now what we need to do is on this container div, we need to use a directive called form array name, and to that we need to assign the name of the form array. And what is the form array name? It is skills. So we are going to assign this value to this form array name directive. Okay. And now inside this form array, since we have three form controls, we need to create three form controls inside this container div. And then we need to connect them in some way. So let me first go ahead and let me copy this input element and let me paste it two more times. And on these input elements, let's also add a placeholder. And here let's say add skill. Let me copy this placeholder from here and let me paste it here and here. Or instead of doing it like this, we know that this form array, it is storing an array of form controls, right? So we can loop over this array, and for each form control, we can display this input element. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these two input elements from here. Let me move this attribute in a separate line. And after that, I'm also going to use ng for directive. Okay, here let's create a variable. Let's call it control of. And then what we want is we want to get access to this array. Okay, now how can we get access to this array? Well, here we have this property called reactive form. And on this reactive form, we can use a get method to get access to this skills form array. For that, all we have to do is we have to say reactive form dot get, and to this get method we need to pass the name of the form array, and the name of the form array is skills. So here you can see the name of the form array is skills, and from this skills array we want to access all the form controls. For that, after this we can specify a set of square brackets, and inside that we can specify the property name, which is controls. So this expression here, it is going to return us this array. Okay, and on that array we are looping over using this ng for directive, and for each iteration, that means for each form control inside this controls property, this input element will be generated. So if you save the changes here and if you go to the web page, you will notice that the three inputs element have been generated here, which says add skill. If I go back and if inside this array, if I add one more form control like this, then it should display four input elements, as you can see. Now, if I go to the Elements tab here, and let me move this a little bit down, and let's expand this app root. Let's expand this section. In there we have the form. Let's scroll down, and here we have the skills form array. If I expand this form array, there we have all the input elements. Now you will notice that none of these input elements has the state. For example, if I scroll up and if I expand this input box, there you will notice that Angular has automatically added a state using this CSS class. So it has this ng untouched state, ng pristine state, ng valid state. But on these form controls, which we have created inside the form array, there we do not see that CSS class. We do not see the state of these form controls. That's because currently these form controls here, so the form control which will be generated using this input element, it is not connected to these form controls. In order to connect them on this input element, we need to use form control name directive. And to this, we need to assign a name. Now these form controls are getting generated dynamically. So which name we should be providing here? Well, since we are creating these form controls inside a form array, for the form control name, we can specify the index of that element in the form array. Okay, so here when we are using this ng for directive, after that I will use a semicolon, and there I will create a variable. I'll call it I equals index. And whatever value we will have inside this I variable, that we want to use as the form control name. So here we are going to assign the value stored in this I variable to this form control name. So here I can say I, but here this I will be treated as a string value. So form control name will be I. But instead of specifying the form control name as I, we want to assign this form control name with the value stored in this I variable. So here we are going to do property binding like this. And with this, if I save the changes, if I go back to the web page, let's expand this app root again, this section again, and let's scroll down. And here we have the skills form array. Now you will notice that on each of the input elements, now the state has also been added. So this ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng valid CSS classes have been added. And you can see that there is also an attribute called ng reflect name, which is for the first input element is 0, for the second input element is 1, for the third input element it is 2, and for the fourth input element it is 3. Okay, so if I go ahead and if I touch this first input element here in the skills array, and if I click outside, you will notice that from the first input element, ng untouched has been removed and ng touched has been added. If I enter some value in that, you will notice that ng pristine has been removed and ng dirty has been added. Let's also go ahead and let's add some validation on these form controls. So let's go to VS Code, and we know how to add validation on a form control. All we have to do is to this form control, we need to pass a validator. For that, we can use this validators. On that, we have a property called required. So we want to make these input fields as required fields. Let's do the same thing for other form controls. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now if I click inside this form control, inside this add skills, if I don't enter a valid value and if I click outside, you will notice that its border has changed to red. So the validation here is also working, as you can see. And if we look at the state of these form controls, you will notice that on these form controls, this ng invalid CSS class and ng touched CSS class has been added. So the state has also changed. So this is how you can create a form array. A form array is basically a collection of form control, form group, or another form array. Now to create a form array, first we define it inside the code. Then we also create a container inside the HTML like we are doing here. And inside that we create the form elements and we bind those form elements to a form control in the form array using form control name. And we also bind the container element to the form array by using this form array name directive. So if I go back to the web page and if we enter some value in the required fields, and now let me go to this console tab, let me clear everything here, and let's click on this submit button. So you will notice that a form group has been logged here. In there we have controls property, and in there you will see this address form group, and you will also see this skills form array. If I expand this skills form array, there also we have this controls property, and in there we have 4 form controls. Okay, and the name of the form control is 0123. So basically here we are using the index of the form control element. And also if I go to the value property, so we should have a value property somewhere. Here we have the value property. There you will see that for all the form controls, we are reading its value. Then for the address form controls, we have the value inside this address object. And then we also have this skills array, as you can see. And inside this skills array, you can see the values like C Sharp, Angular, React, and SQL. So these values are coming from these 4 form controls. And the value entered in these 4 form controls is stored inside an array. Okay, so this is how we create and use a form array in a reactive form. In the next lecture, let's learn how we can generate a form control dynamically using form array. In the last lecture, we learned what is a form array and how to create and use a form array in a reactive form. Now in this lecture, we are going to learn how to add dynamic controls in a form using reactive form approach. And this is one of the advantages which we get when we use reactive form. Using reactive forms, we can add dynamic controls in our form. Let's see how we can do that. So in the last lecture, we created this skills form array. And inside this skills form array, currently we have 4 controls. And what we are doing is, in the HTML file, we are looping over that form array. So here you can see, using this ng for directive, we are looping over that form array. And for each iteration, we are generating this input element dynamically in the form. So if I go to the web page, you will notice that in this form, we have 4 input elements where we can add this skill. If I go back to VS Code and from this form array, if I remove, let's say, 2 of the form controls, in that case, in the web page also, it will show only 2 form controls for skill. As you can see, now it is showing only 2 form controls for adding skill. So basically, we are looping over this form array, and for each element of this form array, we are rendering this input element dynamically. Now, what we want is, initially when this form loads, at that time, we only want to show one input element for adding this skill. For that, all we have to do is, we have to remove the remaining form controls from this skills form array. So now in this skills form array, we have only one form control. So in the web page also, we should see only one skill form control. Now what I also want is, I want to add an add button here, and when that add button is clicked, it should create this add skill input element dynamically, and it should render it here. So for that, let's go back to VS Code and let's first add a button element in the HTML. So after this div, we are going to add a button element, and by default, as we have learned, by default, a button is of type submit. So whenever that button will be clicked, it will submit the form. But we don't want that behavior here. When this button will be clicked, we don't want to submit the form. So here we are going to set its type as button. Okay, and on this button, let's also add a CSS class. So in the app component.css, here I have created a CSS class called button add delete. Let's go ahead and let's add this CSS class for this button. All right. So if you save the changes and if we go back to the web page, there we have this add skills button. And when this button will be clicked, we want to add a form control dynamically, using which user can add multiple skills. For that, on this button element, we are going to bind click event. So let's go back to VS Code, and here on this button element, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. And to this click event, let's assign a method. Let's call it maybe add skills. You can name it anything. And let's go ahead and let's create this method inside the app component class. So here after this on form submitted method, I'm going to create this add skills method. And when this method will be called, what we want is we want to insert a new form control inside this skills form array. So first of all, we need to get access to this skills form array, and we can access it using this reactive form property. So here we can say this dot reactive form, and on that we can use this get method. And to this get method, we need to pass the property name which we want to access here. Here we want to access this skills property. Okay. So this get method here, it will return us this form array. Now using this get method, it is going to return us a value of type abstract control. And form control, form group, and form array, these are the child classes of this abstract control. So this get method, it can return either form group, form array, or form control. Okay, and what we want is when this form array will be returned to us, on that we want to use push method. But here you see this push method is not available. Push method is only available on form array. But since this get method is going to return abstract control, a form group, and a form array. All these three are of type abstract control. But only form array has the push method. So here we know that this skills, it is going to return us a form array. So here we are going to explicitly typecast it to form array. And let's wrap this complete statement within parentheses. So this expression here, it will return us a form array, and on that form array we will have the push method, as you can see. And using this push method, we can push a new form control to this skills array. So here let's use this new keyword, and then what do we want to push here? We want to push an instance of form control. And let's pass an initial value here. Let's say null. And the form control which we are pushing here, it should be a required field. So I'm also going to add this validator on that. Okay, let's move this into a separate line so that it will be more readable. All right, so now what will happen is whenever this add skill button will be clicked, it is going to call this add skill method. And in that method, what we are doing, we are pushing a new form control to this skills array. So if we save the changes now, and if we go to the web page, and every time I click on this skills button, you see it is adding a control dynamically in this form. As you can see here, every time this add skill button is clicked, it is rendering a new form control in the form. And these form controls here, these are being generated dynamically. Let me actually show you that. So let's refresh the page here. So initially there will be only one form control for adding skills. Let's go to Elements tab. There we have this form. Let's scroll down, and here we have this div for the skills. If I expand that, currently you will see there is only one input element in that div. But as soon as I click on this add skills button, you will see one more input element has been added here. If I click again, one more input element has been added here. So these input elements, these form controls, these are being generated dynamically. And this is how, using reactive form, we can generate a form control dynamically. Now, let's also go ahead and let's fill this form, and let's see if in the value property, the values entered in these form controls are displayed or not. So first of all, we need to fill all the required fields, otherwise the submit button will not be enabled. So let's go ahead and let's fill all the required fields. And as you can see, these skill fields which have been generated dynamically, they are also required fields because we have added this required validator on those dynamically generated form controls also. So those are also required fields. So let's add some skills here. Okay, and let's click on this submit button. So let's go to console tab. Let me clear everything here and let's click on this submit button. Let's expand this form group, and there let's expand this value property. So we have all the values captured here, and for the skills property you can see we have an array, and in that array we have the values which we have entered for skill input elements. So we had entered C Sharp, Angular and React, and those values have been captured and it is an element of this skills array. So from the dynamically generated form controls also we are able to read its value. All right. Now let's also see how we can remove a form control dynamically from a form. Again, let's go back to VS Code, and in the HTML, after this input element, let me go ahead and let me add a button element. And here let's say delete. Here let's set its type to button, and on this button also let's add this CSS class. And what we will also do is let's wrap it within a div. So I'll move this input element and this button element inside this div, and on this div let's add a CSS class and let's call it column. And what we also want is for each of the input element we also want to have this delete button. So we are going to move this ng-for directive on this above div. So I'll cut this expression from here and we will add it on this div, because for each skill we want to have this input element, okay, and we also want to have this delete button so that that skill can be deleted. All right, I hope you got the point. So if I go to the web page, initially we have one input element for adding the skill, and for that we also have this delete button. Then if I click on this add skill again we have an input element to add another skill, and there for that input element we also have this delete button. Again if I click on this add skill, again we have this add skill form control, and for that we have this delete button. Now what we want is when this delete button is clicked, we want to remove this form control from this form. So on that delete button, let's again go ahead and let's bind click event. So here on this button, let's go ahead and let's bind click event, and to that let's assign a method on skill delete, or maybe let's call it as delete skill. And let's go ahead and let's create this method inside the app component.ts. So after add skill, let's also go ahead and let's create this method delete skill. Now in order to delete a skill, first we need to get the index of that skill which we want to delete. For example, let's say the user has added 3 skills. Now he want to delete the second skill. Basically he want to delete this second form control from the form. So we need to get access to this form control using its index. Now from where we are going to get the index? Well, in the HTML file, we are looping over each element of this skills array. And for each iteration, we are also getting its index, and we are storing it inside this variable I. So we are going to pass this variable I to this delete skill method. Okay, and here in this method, we are going to receive a value. Let's call it index, and it is going to be of type number. And using this index, we are going to delete that skill from this skills form array. So first of all, we need to get access to this skills form array. For that, again, we can use this expression. I'll copy it, I'll paste it here, and let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable. Let's call it controls. And from within this controls, we want to remove an element based on its index. So here we can say controls dot remove at, and we want to remove from the given index, the index which we are receiving for this delete skill method as its parameter. Let's save the changes and let's see if it works. So let's go back to web page. Okay, Let me go ahead and let me add a skill. Let's say C sharp. Let's add one more skill, Angular, and let's add one more skill, React. Now I want to delete this Angular skill. So I can click on this delete button and that skill has been removed. It has been deleted. So that form control has been removed from this form. Let's go to Elements tab. Again, let's scroll down to the div where we are displaying the skills here. So currently you see we have two elements, two divs in there. In the first div, we have an input element and a button. In the second div also, we have an input element and a button. Now let's say I want to delete this first form control from here. So when I click on this delete button, this div should be removed. Let's see if that happens. So when I click on the delete button of this first form control for the skills, you will see that that div has been removed from the DOM. So this is how we can remove a form control dynamically from a given form. Now, just like we can add or remove form controls dynamically from a form, in the same way, we can also add or remove form groups from a form dynamically. In the last lecture, we learned how to add a form control dynamically to a reactive form. And we also learned how to remove a form control from a reactive form dynamically. Now, in this lecture, we will learn how to add and remove a form group dynamically from a reactive form. Now, we know that a form group is a collection of form controls. And in many web applications, for example, in a job portal website, when you create your profile, there you can add multiple experiences from your previous companies. In the same way, in an e-commerce website like Amazon, you can add multiple addresses in your Amazon account. And we can achieve something like that for our Angular application by rendering a form group dynamically. So in a form group, we will have multiple form controls. And when we render a form group dynamically, that means we can render multiple form controls dynamically at a time. Let's try to understand this with an example. So what I want is, in this form, I also want to allow user to add experience from his previous organizations. Let's see how we can implement that. So let's go to VS Code. And the first thing which we are going to do is, in this reactive form, inside this form group, we are going to create a new form array. And I'm going to call it experience. And it is going to be of type form array. So to this, we are going to assign an instance of form array. And to this form array, we need to pass an array. Now, when we create a form array in the HTML, we should have a container element which we can bind to that form array. So let's scroll down. And here, before this submit button, let me go ahead and let me add a div. Okay, on this div, I'll add a CSS class. So I'm adding this input box CSS class and this experience CSS class. And I've already created these CSS classes in the app component.css file. Now what we want is, we want to bind this container div to this form array. To do that, let's copy this form array name. And on this container div, we need to use a directive, and the directive name is form array name. And to that, let's assign this property name, which is experience. Okay, so now this div, it is binded to this form array. Now inside this form array, I'm going to create an instance of form group. So we are creating a form group inside this form array. And to the form group, to the constructor of the form group, we need to pass an object. So now the next thing which we need to do is, in the container div, which we are binding to this form array, inside that div, we need to create another container div. And we will bind that container div to this form group. So on this div, we are going to use another directive called form group name. And to this, we need to assign a value. Now, what value should we assign to this form group name? Well, when we were looping over this skills array, at that time, to this input form control, we were assigning a form control name. And what is the form control name here? It is the index of that form control in that form array. Same thing we are going to do for this form group name. So to this form group name, we are going to assign the index of form group inside this experience form array. Currently inside this experience form array, we have created only one form group, but we can have multiple form groups inside this experience form array. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to loop over this experience form array, and for each iteration, we are going to assign its index to this form group name. So for each element inside this form array, we want to generate this div dynamically. And whatever content we have inside this div, we want to generate it dynamically. So on this div, I'm going to use ng for directive. And to this, let's assign a TypeScript expression. So here, let's create a variable. Let's call it exp of, and then now we need to get access to this experience form array. And doing that is very simple. We are already doing it for skills. So here you see on this reactive form, we are using this get method to get access to this skills form array. In the same way, let me copy this line. Let's paste it here. And here, instead of skills, we are going to pass the name of this form array. And then this is going to return us this expression. It is going to return us this form array. From within that form array, we want to get all its form controls. And we will have all the form controls inside the controls property of that form array. So on that, we are going to use this square bracket notation, and to that we will pass the property name, which is controls. And this controls property, it is going to store all the controls of that form array as its element. So this controls here, it is going to be an array, and inside that array, whatever form group or form control or form array we have inside this experience form array, that will be created as an element of this controls array. All right, so we are looping over that array. And after this line, let's use a semicolon, and let's also get the index of each element from that array. For that, let's create a variable. Let's call it I, and to that, let's assign this index variable. So this index variable, it is going to return us the index of the current form element on which this ng for is looping over. And we are assigning that index to this variable I. So in this variable I, we will have the index of that form group in this experience form array. And we want to assign that value to this form group name. So here I'm going to assign I. Now this I, it is a variable, and we want to assign its value to this form group name. So here we are going to do property binding. Okay. All right. Now what I'm going to do is inside this div, we are going to create some form controls. And in order to save some time, I have already created it. So let me copy this one from here and let me paste it here. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And if I scroll down, here you will see that that HTML is being displayed here. Okay. So this is in the UI. Now let's go back to VS Code, and inside this form group, let's create some form controls. So we need form controls for company name, for position. So here the user can select what was his position in his previous organization, the total number of years of experience, start date when he started in that company, and last date. So what was the last working day in the previous organization? Okay, so we want to create these 5 controls in this form group. So let's create those controls. Let's create a property called company, and to that let's assign a new form control. And initially let's pass the value as null. In the same way, let's also create form controls for position, experience. I'll call it as total exp. Then let's also create a form control for start date. I'll simply call it as start. And let's create a form control for end date. I'll simply call it as end. So here we are creating form controls inside this form group. And we have also added some form elements inside this container div, which we are binding to that form group. Now all we have to do is, now we need to bind these input elements with these properties. Okay, for that, on each of these input elements, we need to use form control name directive, and to that we need to assign the form control property to which we want to bind it to. Here we want to bind this input element to this company form control. So I'll copy this name and let's assign it to this form control name directive. Let's do the same thing for other form elements. So on this select also, let's use the form control name, and there we want to bind it to this position form control. Then let's do it for experience, and there the form control name is total exp. Let's do it for this start date input element, and there the control name is start. And let's do the same thing for end date, and there the form control name is end. So in this way we are binding these form controls to these properties of form group. Okay, now let's do one more thing. So after this div, the container div, which we are binding to this form array, after that let's go ahead and let's create one more button element. Let's set its type to button, and on this we are going to use this add delete css class. So if I scroll down, we have this button add delete css class. So let's go ahead and let's add this css class on this button element, and here let's say add experience. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and here we have this button add experience. Now what we want is, initially these form controls should not be displayed in this form. Only when the user clicks on this add experience button, then only these form controls should be rendered in the form. So on this button element, we are going to bind click event, and to that let's assign a method, and let's call it add experience. And let's go ahead and let's create this method in the app component class. So after this delete skill, let's go ahead and let's create this method add experience. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. I'll call it maybe form group. And initially we don't want to display this form group. Okay, so I'll cut it from here. So I'll cut this expression from here. Okay, so initially this experience form array should be empty. We should not see any experience form group in the form. And I'm going to assign that form group to this variable, to this form group variable. If I save the changes, if I go back to the web page, so you see, initially there is no form group displayed. Only when we click on this add experience button, then only that form group with all the form controls should be rendered in this form. So when this button will be clicked, we are creating a form group. Now we are going to push this form group inside this experience form array. For that, first we need to get access to this experience form array. So just like how we get access to this skills form array, in the same way, we are also going to get access to the experience form array. So here, let's first access the reactive form property. On that, we are going to use this get method. To this get method, we will pass the property name, and the property name here is experience. Now, this expression, this get method, it is going to return us an abstract control. But we know that this experience is of type form array. So here we will explicitly convert it to form array. We will typecast it to form array so that we can use push method on it. And let's wrap this expression within parentheses. So this expression, it will return us a form array. Basically, it is going to return us abstract control, and we are converting it to form array because this form array, it is a child of this abstract control class. So we can convert it to form array. And on that, we can use push method. Now, what do we want to push here? We want to push this form group. So let's go ahead and let's push it here. And that's it. If I save the changes, if we go back to the web page, now every time I click on this add experience, you will see that form group has been added. If I click again, another form group has been added. If I click again, another form group has been added. So here user can enter multiple experience. Okay, and these form groups are getting generated dynamically. Now here where we are displaying this experience, what I'll do is instead of only showing experience, I'll say experience 1, experience 2, experience 3, like that. So here we have that label. After this, let's use string interpolation syntax and let's use this index variable. Okay, so here we'll say I plus 1. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now when I click on this experience, here it says experience 1. Again, if I click on this add experience, here it says experience 2. Again, if I click, here it says experience 3. All right. Now what we'll also do is we will move this CSS class from here. So I'll cut it from here and let's add it on this div. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. So when I click on this add experience, here is the first experience. Here is the second experience. Here is the third experience. So now they are a little bit separated. Okay. So this is how we can generate multiple form controls together with the help of form group. And you can also see that these form groups are getting generated dynamically. So if I scroll down, here we have this div for experience. So this div we have binded to the experience form array. Inside that div, you will see that we have 3 divs. And each div here, it is binded to form group. So for the first div, if I expand it, you see the name is 0. Right, so we are assigning the index number for the form group name. So you can see the name here is 0. For the second div, if I expand this one, there you will see that the ng reflect name, it is 1. And for the third div, it is 2. So based on the index number, we are assigning a name for that form group. And in each of these form groups, we will have the company input. So here you can see we have the company input. Then we have this div. Inside that div, we will have this position drop down. Then we also have this experience input element. And we also have start date and end date. Okay, so currently we have 3 divs because we have added 3 experiences. Okay, so you see we have 3 divs currently. If I go ahead and if I click on this add experience button again, you will see one more div will be added here. So if I click on this add experience again, you see one more div has been added. So these form controls, basically each form group here, it is getting generated dynamically. All right, now let's go ahead and let's enter some value in the required fields of this form. Let's enter a skill. I'll only enter one skill. And let's enter experiences. So let's say first company is ABC. Let's select a position. Let's select experience 2 years, start date, some date, and end date. Let's do the same thing for the second experience. Let's say company name is XYZ. Experience 3 years. Let's select a start date and let's select an end date. In the same way, let's enter some details for experience 3. Let's say company name is ABB. Software developer, experience 5 years. Let's select some start date and end date. Finally, for this fourth experience also, let's enter a company name, some random company name. Position, experience, let's say 6 years. Start date and end date. Now let's go to this console tab. Let's clear everything here. And now let's click on this submit button. Let's expand this form group. There you will see we have controls, and there we should see the experience control, and it is of type form array. So all the form controls inside this experience form array will be an element of an array. So if I expand this here, we have an array, as you can see, and in that array we have 4 form groups. So you see 4 form groups, and in each form group we will have some form controls. So for that, we can expand this controls property of that form group. So we have this company, in date, position, start date, and total experience form control. Okay. Then if we expand this value property here, there, all the values which we have entered in these form controls that can be seen. And there you will also see this experience control, this experience property. And if I expand this property, there we have an array, and in that array we have 4 elements because we have added 4 experiences here. So we have 4 elements, and whatever value we have entered for each of these experiences, that you can check here. So for the first experience, we added company as ABC. We added this end date, we added position, start date, and total experience. In the same way, for the second experience also, we entered these values. Then for the third experience, we entered these values. And for the fourth experience, we entered these values. So you can read those values from this experience property of this value property. All right. Now, finally, what I also want to do is, if the user wants, he can also delete an experience. Okay. So when this delete button will be clicked, that particular experience, that means that particular form group, should be removed from the experience form array. And again, doing that is very simple. All we have to do is on this delete experience button. So here we have that delete experience button. On this button, let's add this click event, and here instead of calling it add skill, let's call it delete experience. Okay, let's go ahead and let's create this method in the app component class. So after the add experience, let's go ahead and let's create this delete experience. And again, we are going to delete an experience. We are going to delete a form group from this experience form array based on its index. And how are we going to get that index? If I go to HTML, there you will see that we are looping over this experience form array. And for each iteration, we are also calculating its index, and we are storing it in this variable I. So we are going to pass this variable I to this delete experience method. All right. And in the app component class, here, let's specify a parameter. Let's call it index. You can name it anything. It is going to be of type number. And using that index, we want to delete an experience, a form group from this experience form array. So first, we need to get access to this experience form array. To do that, we can use this expression. Okay. And here, instead of skills, we need to pass the form array name, which is experience in this case. Let's pass it here, and it will return us that form array. Let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable. Let's call it form array. And from that form array, we want to remove a form group, an experience. So for that, on this form array, let's call this method remove at. And to that, we are going to pass the index of that form group which we want to remove. And we are going to receive that index inside this index parameter. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So let's add an experience. For that, let's click on this add experience button. Let's create two experience. Let's say the company name is ABC. Let's select a position, and let's say experience is 2 years. In the same way here, let's say company name is XYZ. Let's select a position. Let's say experience is 3 years. And here, let's also select the start date and end date. Okay. Now what I want is, I want to delete this experience. So when I click on this delete button, you see that experience has been deleted, and this experience has now become the first experience. If I go ahead and if I add one more experience, and without entering anything, if I click on this delete button, it should be deleted. So this is how we can remove a form group dynamically from the reactive form. So this is all about creating and using dynamic form controls. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, you're going to learn how you can create a custom validator to validate the input data in a form control. So we have already worked with built-in validators like required, email, etc. Now we are going to create a user-defined validator which we can use on a form control in order to validate the data which the user has inputted in that form control. And in order to create a custom validator, first we need to understand what is an error code and how it works. So what I'm going to do is, currently this submit button will be enabled only after all the required fields has a valid value. But I'm going to remove that logic. So let's go to appcomponent.html, and from this button, I'm going to remove this disabled property. Okay, but I'll keep it for your reference here. Okay, let me also go ahead and let me comment it. All right, so now this submit button will be enabled always. Okay, let me clear the console here. And if you remember, this first name and last name, these two are required fields. Also, this email is a required field. So let's work with this first name form control and let's try to understand what is an error code. So currently when I go ahead and click on the submit button, this form group has been logged. In this form group, we have this controls property and there we have this first name control. Now, if I expand this first name control, there you will see that we have this errors property and it is assigned with an object where the property name is required and it is set to true. So this required here is nothing but it is an error code. So on this first name input element, we have added a required validator. For that required validator, this required is its error code. So if we don't enter any value inside this first name, in that case, the required validator will fail. And when the required validator will fail, it will return this object and it will be assigned to this errors object. All right. So for the required validator, this required is its error code. Now, if I go ahead and if I enter some value in this field, let's say John, and now if I submit the form, now you will notice that for that first name control, this errors is null because now on this first name form control, there is no validation error. On this first name form control, we have only one validator, the required validator. And since we have provided a value for that field, now the required validator has succeeded. There is no validation errors. So when the validator has passed, it is returning null and that is assigned to this errors property. Next, let's look into the email field. So if I expand this email field, you will see that this email is also a required field. And inside this email field, we have not entered any value. So to this errors property, an object has been assigned and there we can see the property name as required. So this required error code has been returned by the required validator and it has been assigned to this errors property of email control. Now, if I go ahead and if I enter some value in this field, some random value, which is not a proper email, and now if I submit the form, let's go back and let's expand the controls property and there let's expand this email form control. Now, there you will notice that we don't have required error code. Now we have this email error code because this field is required and on this field we are also using another validator called email. So if I go back to VS Code, on this email field, we are using two validators, the required validator and the email validator. So we have provided some value inside this email field. So it is not an empty value. That's why the required validator has passed. But this value, it is not a proper email address. So the email validator has failed. And when the email validator has failed, it has returned an error code and that error code is email. So this email is the error code for email validator. So the point which I want to make here is that for a form control, if this errors property is null, that means on that form control, there is no validation error. But if this errors property is not null, that means on that form control, some validation error has occurred. And we can see what validation error has occurred by looking into this validation error code. So for the email validator, the validation error code is email. For the required validator, the validation error code is required. So looking at the validation error code, we can know that what validation error has occurred on a form control. Okay, so keep in mind that every validator returns an error code when the validation fails on a form control. And we can see that error code using this errors property of the form control. So I hope now you know what is an error code. Now let's see how the built-in validators of Angular are defined. So let's go to this Angular documentation. There, let's go to this docs section. And here, let me search for validators. Okay, here we have the validators. And here you can see all the validators. Now, if I click on this See More button, you will see that each validator is basically a method. It is a static method. So this min is a validator and it is actually a method. In the same way, this max is also a method. It is a validator and a validator is basically a method. Let's scroll down to the required validator. So here also you will see that this required, it is basically a method. Now, what is the signature of this method? So the signature of this method is, it is a static method, and this required method, it is going to take an abstract control. And this abstract control is parent class for form control, form group, and form array. So this required validator, you can use it on a form control, on a form array, or on a form group. Okay, and it is going to return either validation errors. So basically it is going to return a validation error code, or it is going to return null if there is no validation error. So in the same way, we can also create a custom validator. If I scroll down to the email validator, here also you will see that this email is a method. It is a static method, and this email is taking one parameter, abstract control. So basically we can use this email validator on a form group, form array, or a form control. And it is either going to return a validation error code if there is some validation error, or it will return null if there is no validation error. So in the same way, we are going to create our custom validator. Now, what custom validator do we want to create? So what I want is, currently in this first name and last name, I can also enter a space, right? But what I want is, in this first name and last name control, user should enter only first name and last name without a space. So user should not be able to enter John, after that a space, or something like John Smith. So this is also not a valid first name. Okay, or he cannot start with a space like this and then enter the first name. This is also not valid. So I want to create a validator to check if in first name and last name control, if the user has used a space. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go back to VS Code, and inside this app folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call it validators. And inside this validators, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this no space allowed dot validator dot ts. Okay, so this is the file name. And inside this file, we are going to create our validator function. So let's create a variable. Let's call it maybe no space allowed. So this will be the validator name. And to this, let's assign a function. And this function, it is going to receive a form control. So we are going to use this no space allowed only on form controls. We are not going to use it on form array or form group. So here I'm going to specify a parameter. I'll call it control, and it should be of type form control. And in order to use this form control, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. And inside this, we are going to write the logic to check if a form control contains a space. So here let's write this if statement. And first we will check if this control's value property is null or not. So here let's check control dot value. If it is not equal to null, then we will check another condition. And in this condition, we will check if the value of that form control contains a space. So we can say control dot value dot, and I'm going to use this method index of, and to this we will pass space. Okay, so this index of method will return the index of the first occurrence of this space in a value. But if there is no space in that value, in that string value, in that case, this index of will return -1. So here we will check if it is not equal to -1, that means that value contains a space. In that case, what do we want to do is we want to return an object. And in that object, we are going to specify a return code. Let's call that return code no space allowed. Okay, and let's set it to true. Otherwise, if the value does not contain a space, in that case, this index of will return -1. So this if statement will fail and nothing will be returned from within this if statement. So outside of this if statement, we will write the return statement, and from here we will return null. So if the value does not contain any space, that means it is a valid value. In that case, we are going to return null. And whatever value we are returning from here, that will be assigned to the errors property of form control. So let's save the changes. And now we want to use this no space allowed on the first name and last name control. So let's first go ahead and let's import it from this file. So in the app component.ts at the top, we are going to write the import statement, and we want to import it from validators slash no space allowed validator. So from this file. Now, in order to import it, we also need to export this method, this function. So here, let's use the export statement. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to app component.ts, and let's use this no space allowed validator on the first name and last name control. Now, since we want to use multiple validators on this first name and last name, we need to wrap it within square brackets like this. And after that, we can specify multiple validators. Okay, let's do the same thing on the last name. Let's save the changes and let's see if it works. So let's go back to the web page. And in there, let's say I specify a name, John with a space. Now, if I click outside, you will notice that here we have an error. Now the error message says the first name is required field. We will change this error message later. But here we have provided a name, but then we have a space here. So in that case, a validation error has occurred on this first name control. Now what validation error has occurred? Let's check that. Let's go ahead and let's submit this form. And if I expand this form group there, if I expand this controls, and if I expand this first name control, you can see this errors property, it is assigned with this object, and there the error code is no space allowed. The same error code which we are returning from this no space allowed function. Okay, so this no space allowed validator is working as expected. If I remove that space, then there is no validation error. And same thing will happen on the last name as well. So in the last name, if I say space Smith, and if I click outside, you will see that we have an error here because space is not allowed in the first name and last name. Okay, but if I remove this space, then that validation error is gone. So this no space allowed validator, it is working as expected. Now here we have created this no space allowed validator as a function, but we can also create it as a method. So what I will do is I'll simply create a class. I'll call it custom validators. Okay, let's also export this class, and let's create this function as a method inside this class. So I'll cut it from here, I'll paste it here, and let's remove this equal to sign. Okay, and let's also remove this statement from here. And here we are not using arrow function syntax, so let's remove that arrow syntax from there. Okay, so here now we are creating a method. Now let's make this method static by using the static keyword. All right, now let's save the changes. So now from this file, we are no more exporting the no space allowed function, but now we are exporting custom validators class. So let's copy this. Let's go to app component.ts, and there let's import custom validators class. And here we can use custom validators class, and in that we have a static method no space allowed. So this is how we can use that static method. In the same way, here also we are going to use the custom validator class, and in that we have a static method, no space allowed. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's quickly check if it is still working. So if I enter a name inside this first name control, and if I enter a space and if I click outside, you will notice that we still have the validation error. And if I go ahead and if I submit this form, and if I expand this form group, controls, first name control, you will see that this errors property, it is assigned with an object, and in that object, the error code is no space allowed. Okay, but if I go ahead and if I remove that space, there is no validation error. If I submit the form again, and if I expand this first name form control, now you will notice that this errors, it is assigned with value null. So in the validator, what we are doing is, if the value contains a space, in that case, we are returning this object, and this object is getting assigned to the errors property of the form control. Otherwise, if the value does not contain a space, in that case, we are returning null, and that is getting assigned to the errors property of form control. Now, what we can also do is, we can use the value which gets assigned to this errors property in order to show a custom validation error message based on the error code. Let's see that. So let's go back to VS Code and let's go to app-component.html. Let's scroll up to the first name input element. Okay, so here we have the first name input element. So we want to show this error message, first name is a required field only when the error code is required. So this expression here, it will give us access to first name form control. In that form control, we have a property called errors. And in that errors, we will have a property called required if the required validation error has occurred on that form control. So here we need to use the square bracket syntax to access the property of this error object, and there we are going to specify the error code as required. Okay, so when the error code is required, in that case, this validation error message will be shown. But let me copy this small element and let's paste it again here. If the error code is no space allowed, okay, so this is the error code which we are returning from this no space allowed validator. So if it contains the error code as no space allowed, in that case, we want to show another error message. No space is allowed for first name. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And here we have an error. It says property error does not exist. That's because the property name is errors and not error. Let's save the changes again. Let's go back to the web page. So the error is gone. Now, if I click inside this first name text box, if I don't enter any value and if I click outside, we see this message, first name is a required field. But if I enter a value and if I enter a space, now you will notice that the error message says no space is allowed for first name. Okay, but if I enter a valid value, you will see that here we have an error. And the error is because now this errors property will be assigned with the value null, right? And on that null, we are trying to access a required property, or on that null, we are trying to access no space allowed property. So since this errors is null, on that null, we are trying to access a property. That's why we are seeing this error, and error says cannot read property of null, reading required. Right. So to avoid this error, what we can do is here we can use optional chaining. So after this errors, we can use a question mark and then dot. And this operator is called as optional chaining. Let's do the same thing here. So basically, if this expression returns null, for example, in the first name, if we have provided a proper first name without any space, in that case, this errors will be assigned with the value null. So this expression here will return null. And when expression returns null or undefined, and after that, if we have used this optional chaining operator. In that case, the further expressions are not evaluated. So if this expression has returned null, after that, this expression will not be evaluated. If it does not return null or undefined, then only the further expressions will be evaluated. Okay, so in this way, we can resolve this problem. If I save the changes, if I go back now, and if I click inside this first name, if I click outside, we have this error message. First name is a required field. If I enter a valid value, let's say John, we don't have any error. But if I enter a space, we have this error, no space allowed for first name. But if I remove this space, we don't have any validation error message, and we also don't have any error in the console. So this is how we can show a specific validation error message based on what error has occurred on the form control using the errors property of the form control. Because if there is any validation error on the form control, then the errors property will be assigned with an object with the validation error code. We can make use of that validation error code to show a specific validation error message. But if the errors property is assigned with the value null, that means no validation error has occurred on that form control. In the last lecture, we learned how to create a custom validator in Angular. Now in this lecture, you're going to learn what is an async validator and how to create and use it. We use async validator when we need to send an HTTP request to the server to check if the data which the user has inputted inside a form control, if that data is valid or not. So basically, when we send an HTTP request to the server might take some time in sending the response. And once we have the response, then only we can validate whether the data entered in a form control is valid or not. For that, we use async validator. Now, creating an async validator is very similar to creating a sync validator. The only difference is that the async validator must return either a promise or an observable. And another point to keep in mind is that Angular does not provide any built-in async validator. In Angular, all the built-in validators are sync validators. For example, the required validator, the email validator, min and max validator, all these are sync validators. Angular does not have any built-in async validators. But Angular do allow us to create our own custom async validators and use it on a form control or a form group. So in this lecture, let's see how we can create and use an async validator in Angular. So here we have our form, and in this form, we also have this username input element. Now, when the user is registering using this registration form, at that time user has to provide a username. Now, that username must be unique for each user. So if the user is providing a username which already exists for another user, then our application should not allow that user to use that username. For that, what we need to do is, as soon as the user has entered a username, we need to check whether with that username, a user already exists or not in the database. If there is already a user with that username, in that case, we will show an error message that the username is already taken. Otherwise, with that username, if the user does not exist, then we will allow the user to use that username. Now, here for this application, I'm not using any backend database or any API, but we are going to simulate that situation. So what we are going to do is, we are going to create a function, and let's create that function inside this file itself, inside this no space allowed.validator.ts file. There I'm going to create a function, and we will assume that this function is an API to which we are making a call from our Angular application. So here let's create a function, and let's call this function username allowed. You can name this function anything. And this function is going to receive a username, and it is going to be of type string. All right. Now inside this function, let's first create a variable. Let's call it taken usernames. And to this, let's assign an array. So basically, this data, the taken usernames, we will read it from the database. But here, since we don't have any database for this application, we are going to make use of this array. And inside this array, we are going to specify some usernames which is already taken. For example, John Smith, Manoja, and Sarah King. Okay, so these three are the usernames which is already taken. So a user should not be able to register with any of these usernames. All right. Now what we are going to do is from within this function, we are going to return a promise. For that, we are using this promise constructor. And to this constructor, we need to pass a callback function. And this callback function is going to receive two arguments, resolve and reject. Now, inside this function, I'm going to use setTimeout function to simulate this situation where the response is going to take some time to reach the client. So to the setTimeout also, we need to pass a callback function and we also need to pass a time interval. Let's say 5000 milliseconds. That means 5 seconds. Okay, so let's say from our client, we are making a request to this API, username allowed, and this API is going to return us a response after 5 seconds. So after 5 seconds, this callback function will be executed, and from within this callback function, we are going to return some data. Now inside this callback function, what we are going to do is we are going to check if the username which we are receiving here for this method, if it already exists inside this taken username array. So here we will say taken usernames dot includes, and to this we are going to pass this username. So if inside this array we already have an element with the username value, in that case this includes method will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. So if it returns true, that means with this username, there is already a user which exists. In that case, we are going to return a promise. And with that promise, we are going to return an object. And in this object, we are going to specify an error code. Let's say the error code is check username, and we are going to set it to true. All right. But if with this username, there is no user inside this taken username array, in that case, we want to return another data. So in that case also, we are going to return a promise. For that, I'm going to call this resolve method. And we want to resolve it to null. That means there is no user with the given username inside this taken usernames array. Okay, let's save the changes inside this function. Now we are going to create an async validator. And we are going to create that async validator inside this custom validators class. So after this no space allowed validator, again we are going to create another validator. And as we have learned earlier, a validator is nothing but a method. So here I'm going to create a static method. I'm going to call it check username. Okay, now here we need to specify a parameter for this check username. So on whichever form control or form group or form array, we will use this check username. We are going to receive that form control, form array or form group as a parameter for this check username method. So here I'm going to call it as control and it should be of type abstract control. And in order to use this abstract control, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. Okay, so since we are using this abstract control, we can use this validator on form group, form array, or form control, because form group, form array, and form control, it is a child class of this abstract control class. All right. Now from within this function, we are simply going to call this username allowed function. So let's call this username allowed function. And to this, we need to pass a value for this username parameter. Right. So this control, if it is of type form control, then it will have a value property, and that value property will store a primitive value like string value, number, boolean, etc. So whatever value is set for the value property of that control, we want to assign it to this username. So here I'll simply say control dot value. So for example, let's say if we use it on a form control, the form control will have a value property, and that value property will store the value which we have entered inside that form control. And we want to pass that value, we want to assign that value to this username parameter. Now, this function here, this username allowed function, it is going to return us a promise because from here we are returning a promise, right? And as we have learned earlier, an async validator must return a promise or an observable. So here this async validator, it is going to return a promise of type any. All right. And we want to return that promise from within this validator method. And that's it. In this way, we have created an async validator. And an async validator must return a promise or an observable. Here, what it is going to return? If the username which we have passed to this username allowed function, if it exists inside this array, in that case, it is going to return a promise with this data. Otherwise, it is going to return a promise with the value null. Okay, now let's save the changes and let's go ahead and let's use this check username validator on the username form control. So let's go to app component.ts. Here we have the username form control. There we are passing the first argument as null, so we don't want to set any default value. And the second argument which we pass to a form control should be a list of sync validators which we want to use on that form control. Now on this username form control, we don't want to use any sync validator, or if we want, we can use the required validator on this username. So let's go ahead and let's use validators dot required. So this required, it is a built-in validator and it is a sync validator. So the second argument which we pass to the form control, it is a sync validator or a list of sync validator, like we are passing here to this email form control. Here we are passing multiple validators, so we have wrapped it within an array. So here the second parameter is a list of sync validator, and for username we are passing only a single validator, and that is also a sync validator. And the third argument for the form control is a list of async validator. Now here on this username, we want to use this check username async validator. So we need to pass it as the third argument, and we need to access it on this custom validators class. So here we can say custom validators dot check username. Okay, so keep in mind that the async validator should be the third parameter, the third argument to the form control. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's go to Elements tab here. And here we have the username input element. So let me expand that. And currently you will notice that on this username field, currently the state is it is untouched, it is pristine, and ng invalid has been added because on this username we have used the required validator. Now let's go ahead and let's enter some username. So let's say John Smith. Now you will notice that on this ng pending CSS class has been added, and after 5 seconds you can see ng invalid CSS class has been added. Now this ng invalid CSS class is there because this John Smith, this username already exists in this array, as you can see. So that is not allowed username, and that's why here we can see ng invalid CSS class added, and you can also see the red border here. But if I go ahead and if I enter some other username which is not available inside that array, for example maybe XYZ, it will take 5 seconds to validate that, and for that 5 seconds this ng pending CSS class will be added. And after 5 seconds, once the data is validated, so after 5 seconds this XYZ, this value will be checked with this array. In this array we don't have any username with the value XYZ, so in that case it is returning null, and in that case the data is valid. So now you will not see any red border here. But if I enter a username which already exists, for example Manoj Jha, again you will see this ng pending for 5 seconds, and after 5 seconds when the data will be validated, now you will see ng invalid. Okay, so this is how we can create and use an async validator. Now, if you want, you can also use the ng pending CSS class to show a yellow border by the time the data is being verified. So let's go to VS Code and let's go to appcomponent.css. Let's scroll down. And here we are using this input ng invalid and ng touched. In the same way, let me copy this CSS code. Let's paste it here. And here we want to check ng touched and ng pending. So if the form element is of type input, and on that form element, if this ng pending and ng touched CSS class is added, then we want to show a yellow border around that input element. Or in fact, we don't need to check this ng touched. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And here, let me type something, let's say. So by the time you will notice, this yellow border is there. And after 5 seconds, that yellow border is gone. And we don't have any red border because I wanted to check for Manoj Jha, this username. So for the 5 seconds, you will see yellow border. And after 5 seconds, when the data will be validated with this username, we already have a user in that array. So you can see the red border is there. But if I change the username to something else, then again for the 5 seconds, it will validate the data. And after 5 seconds, once the data is validated, with this username, we don't have any user. So now we don't see any red border. So this is all about async validator in Angular. Always remember that an async validator must return a promise or an observable. And rest of the implementation is same as the sync validator. Hello and welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to talk about two another important properties of a reactive form, which is value changes and state changes. So value changes and state changes are two events on a reactive form. So in this lecture, we are going to learn when these events gets fired and how we can listen to these events. The value changes is an event which is raised by Angular forms whenever the value of the form control, form group or form array changes. Let's try to understand it with an example. So in this form, we have several form controls. Now let's take example of this first name form control. So in this first name form control, when we will start typing something, every time the value in this first name form control will change, the value changes event will be raised on this first name form control. So for example, when I type A, the value has changed in the first name form control. So at this time, the value changes event will be raised on this first name form control. Again, if I type something else, again, the value changes event will be raised on this first name form control. And we can listen to this event and we can do something whenever this event happens. To listen to this event, let's go to VS Code and let's go to appcomponent.ts file. Let me close this no space allowed validator.ts file and let me also close this appcomponent.css file. All right. So inside this ng on init method, what we are going to do is after we have created this reactive form, what we want is we want to listen to value changes event on this first name form control. So first of all, we will have to get access to this first name form control. To do that, here we can simply say this dot reactive form, and on that we can call the get method. And to this get method, we can pass the property name as a string value. So here we want to listen value changes event on this first name control. So we will pass this property name to this get method. Okay. And it is going to return us the first name form control. And on this form control, we will have a property called value changes. Now this value changes property, it is going to return an observable as you can see. And we can subscribe to that observable using this subscribe method. And now to this subscribe method, we can pass a callback function. And this callback function will be called every time the value inside this first name form control will change. And we are going to receive the new value as an argument to this callback function. So here, let's call it as value. Now let's simply go ahead and let's log that value in the developer console. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let me clear everything in this console. And now, as soon as the value inside this first name form control will change, for example, if I type A inside it, you will notice that that value has been logged. So basically, value changes event was raised, and when that event was raised, this callback function was called. And when this callback function was called, we are logging the value which we are going to receive for this value parameter. And what value we are receiving for this value parameter? The value which we have typed inside this first name form control. If I type something else, again, the value changes event will be raised and it will log the value which we have entered inside this first name form control. Okay, so as you can see, every time I type something inside this first name form control, it is raising the value changes event. And whenever the value changes event is raised, since we have subscribed to that event, that value is getting logged here. But if I type something in some other control, for example, in the last name control, at that time you will not see that value changes event being raised because we are not listening to the value changes event on this last name form control. We are listening it on the first name form control. Now, just like we can listen to value changes event on a form control, we can also listen to value changes event on a form group. Let's see that in action. So let's go back to VS Code. And here, instead of listening on the first name form control, now we want to listen to value changes event on this form group. So we are assigning this form group to this reactive form property. So now we want to listen to value changes event on that form group. So for that, let's first access that form group, and that form group is present inside this reactive form property. And on that also, we can listen to value changes event. Again, this value changes event, it is going to return an observable, and we can subscribe to that observable. And whenever the value will change on this form group, it is going to call a callback function, which we are passing to this subscribe method. And there we are going to receive some data. Okay, let's go ahead and let's log that data in the developer console. Now, since we are listening to value changes event on a form group, in that form group, in any form control, the value will change. This callback function will be executed. So if I go back to the web page, let's clear the console. And here you will notice that every time I type something in any one of these form controls, so all these form controls belongs to reactive form group. So if in any form control the value will change, the value changes event will be raised on that form group, on the reactive form group. And since we are listening to that event on the reactive form group, the data will be logged in the console. So for example, if I type something here, you see an object has been logged here. And in that object, we have the value for each of the controls. So in the first name, you can see this A is assigned. If I enter something inside this last name, then also the value changes event will be raised on that form control. And in that case, an object has been logged here. So now you will see that for the first name A is there, for the last name S is there. If I type something in this street address, again that object will be logged. So every time the value of any one of these form controls changes, it is going to emit the value changes event. And you will see that every time we type something in any one of the form control, it is logging some object. Okay. So we can listen for the value changes event on a form control or on a form group or on a form array. Then we have another event called status changes. So the status changes is an event which is raised by Angular Forms whenever Angular calculates the validation status of a form control, form group or form array. Now, validation states can be valid, invalid or pending. And we can listen to this status changes event on a form control, form group or form array. Let's understand status changes event with an example. So let's say I want to listen for status changes event on this email form control. So let's go back to VS Code. And again, I'll comment this line here. So in order to listen status changes event on the email form control, first we need to get access to this email form control. And we already know how to do that. So first we will access this reactive form property. On that, we are going to call the get method. To that, we need to pass the property name. In this case, it is email. So this expression here, it is going to return us email form control. On that email form control, we will have the status changes property. And again, this status changes property, it is also going to return an observable. Okay, and it is going to return us the form control status. And we can subscribe to that observable using the subscribe method. Now to this subscribe method, let's pass a callback function. And this callback function will be called every time the status of the form control changes. Here, let's specify a parameter. Let's call it status. And let's simply go ahead and let's log that status in the console. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let me clear everything. And let me start typing something inside this email form control. So let's say ABC. So you see the status is invalid. Every time I type something here, every time the status is getting calculated. Okay, so the status is invalid. If I say @gmail.com, now it is a valid email. So now the status has changed to valid. So the status can be either valid, invalid, or it can also be pending. Let's use the status changes event on this username form control so that we will also see the pending status. So let's go back to VS Code, and here instead of passing email, let's pass username, which is the form control name. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let's clear everything here. So inside this username, as soon as I start typing something, let's say Manoj, you will see that current status is pending. And after 5 seconds, its status will change to valid, because with this username, we don't have any user in this array, in this taken usernames array. So that's why it is valid. But if I type Manoj Jha, in that case, for 5 seconds, it will be in pending state. And after 5 seconds, it will be invalid, because with this username, we have a username in this taken usernames array. So this is how we can listen to status changes event on a form control. And we can also listen to status changes event on a form group. So let's go back to VS Code. And now let's listen to status changes event on a form group. Let me again comment this. And we are going to listen to status changes event on this reactive form group. So here let's say this dot reactive form dot status changes. And the status changes, we know it is going to return an observable. So let's subscribe to that observable. To this subscribe method, let's pass a callback function. And inside this callback function, we are simply going to log the status of the form group. Okay. And let's pass a parameter here. Let's call it status. All right. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let's clear everything. Now, the status of the form group will be valid only if all its form controls has a valid value. And its status will be invalid if any one of the form control has an invalid value. And the status of the form group will be pending if any form control has a pending status. So for example, let me go ahead and let me type something inside this first name. So still you will see that the status of the form group is invalid, because this last name is also a required field, email is also a required field, and these two form controls has a status of invalid. That's why complete form group is invalid. Let me specify a name in the last name form control. Still it is invalid. Let's specify a value in the email. It is still invalid. And keep in mind that every time the value is changing, the status changes event is being raised. That's why you will see that this invalid is logged 23 times. Now just notice what happens. So as soon as I start typing inside this username, for example, let's say Manoj, you will see that the status of the form group is pending. And after 5 seconds, it is invalid. Okay, this form control, this username form control has a valid value, because with this username, we don't have any user in the taken usernames array. So this form control value is valid, but in this form group, we have other required fields. For example, this street address. So let's enter some street address. Okay, Still the status is invalid because this city is also a required field. Let's enter value for that. Then this postal code is also a required field. Let's enter some value for that. And this skills is also a required field. Let's enter some value for that. And now you will notice that the form group is valid. So when all the form controls in this form group has a valid value, after that only the form group is valid. So using the status changes property, we can get the validation state of a form control, a form group, or a form array. So keep in mind that the status changes event, it is going to emit a string value. That value can be valid, invalid, or pending. And we can make use of these values in order to check if the form is valid or not. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go to VS Code, and there I'm going to create a new property. Let's call this property maybe form status. It is going to be of type string, and initially let's assign it with empty string. Now what we are going to do is we are going to set this form status here. So we'll say this dot form status equals the value which we are going to receive for this status parameter. So for this status parameter, we will receive either valid if the form is valid, if all its form control has a valid value, or it will be invalid if any form control in this form group has an invalid value, or it will be pending if the validation of any form control in this form group has a pending state. Okay, now let's go to appcomponent.html, and there I'm going to use ng class directive, and to this we are going to assign this form status property. So again, this form status will have a value either valid, invalid, or pending. And based on that value, what we want is we want to set a border color around this form, around this section. So now in the app component.css, so on this form control, we are also using this container class. So let me copy this class name, and in the app component.css, here we will say dot container dot valid. So if the section has this container CSS class as well as this valid CSS class, so this valid CSS class will be added by this ng class directive if the form is valid. So this form status will have a value either valid, invalid, or status. So if the form status value is valid, in that case, on this section, we will have this container CSS class as well as valid CSS class. In that case, we want to show a red border around that section. So we are going to set the border, and when it is valid, we want to show a green border. So I'll say green 3 pixel solid. In the same way, if the value of the form status is invalid, in that case, invalid CSS class will be added on that section. So we will also check for that. And in case of invalid, we want to show red border around the section. And finally, we can also have a pending status. In that case, we want to show orange border. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let me start typing something. So you see, there is red border around the form. That's because currently the form is invalid. Now, when I start typing username, you will notice that the orange border is there around the form. And after 5 seconds, it will again change to invalid. Right, because not all the form controls has a valid value. So the state of the form group will be invalid, and in that case, we are displaying the red border. All right, now let's enter value in each of the required fields. Some dummy value. And now the form is valid, and when the form is valid, you can see a green border around that form. So this is one simple use case where you can make use of the validation state of the form group. And to get the validation state of the form group, you can listen to status changes event on that form group. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In this lecture, we are going to learn about setValue and patchValue method in a reactive form. Using setValue and patchValue method on a reactive form is very similar to how we use it on a template-driven form. The setValue method is used to update a form control, form group, or form array value. Now, when we use setValue method, we need to pass an object to the setValue method, and the structure of that object must match the value property of the form control, form group, or form array which we are trying to update. Let's understand this with an example. In this form, we have this create username button. Now what we want is, when a user clicks on this create username button, it should automatically generate a username for that user based on his first name, last name, and date of birth. And then that username should be automatically populated in this username form control. So for that, we can make use of setValue method. Now, when do we want to update this username form control? When this create a username button is clicked. So on this create a username button, let's first go ahead and let's find click event. So let's go to appcomponent.html and let's scroll down to that username input, and here we have this button, and on this button we are going to bind click event, and to this click event let's assign a method. Let's call it maybe generate username. And now let's go ahead and let's create this method inside this app component class. Now in order to save some time, I have already created this method, this generate username method. So I'll copy this logic from here and let's paste it here. So basically what we are doing here is, inside this generate username button, we are getting the value from this first name, last name, and date of birth form control. And we are storing it in these variables fname, lname, and dob. Then we are checking if the first name length is greater than or equal to 3, then we are going to take the first 3 characters from the first name. But if it is less than 3, then we are going to take the full value of the first name. In the same way, if the length of last name is greater than or equal to 3, in that case, we are going to take first 3 characters from the last name. Otherwise, we are going to take the complete last name and we are going to append it to this username variable. In the same way, we are also reading the value of date of birth and we are converting it to date value. And from that date, we are getting the full year, the birth year from that date of birth. And then we are appending it to this username. Finally, here we are converting the username all to lowercase, and then we are logging the username here. So if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, let's enter a first name, let's say John. Let's enter a last name, let's say Smith, and let's select a date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you will notice that a username has been generated based on the first name, last name, and date of birth. Okay, but if I don't enter any value in this first name field and in this last name field, and if I click on this create a username button, you will see that the username is 2023. So basically it is only displaying the year from the date of birth because first name and last name is empty. Okay, if I refresh the page and I simply click on this create a username button, so we have not entered any value in the first name, last name, and date of birth field. If I click on this create a username button, you see we have an error because in the code we are trying to read the length of first name and last name control, but since we have not provided any value here, the value in these form controls will be null because that's what we are passing as a default value for these form controls, and on that null we are trying to read the length value. So what we need to do is, if there is no value in the first name, last name, and date of birth, then we will disable this create a username button. Only when the first name, last name, and date of birth values are supplied, then only this create a username button should be enabled. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go back to VS Code and let's go to appcomponent.html, and we want to disable this button if the first name, last name, and date of birth does not contain a value. So here we are going to use the disable attribute, and on this we are going to do property binding. So what is the condition we are going to check? We are going to check if the first name form control, last name form control, and date of birth form control contains a value, then only we want to enable this button. Otherwise, this button should be disabled. So to get the value of first name form control on this reactive form property, we can use get method, and to this we need to pass the name of the form control, which is first name dot value. So if it contains a value, in that case this expression will return true. Otherwise, if it does not contain a value, in that case it will be either empty string or it will be null, right? So in that case this will return false. So let me wrap it within parenthesis like this. Okay, so if the first name contains a value, in that case this expression will return true. In that case, we don't want to disable the button. In that case, we want to enable the button. So here I'll use the not operator. Now, not only first name, we also want to check for last name and date of birth. So here we'll also use or operator. Actually, we need to use and operator, because if all the three fields have some value, then only we want to enable the button. So for the property name, let's pass last name, and again let's use and operator. And here for the property name, let's pass date of birth. Now we can move these end statements in a separate line in order to make it more readable. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's see if this button is enabled or not. So when I click on this create a username button, so button is still not disabled. Let's see why is that. All right, we need to move this parenthesis here. Now let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now when I click on this create a username button, we don't see any error. But if I enter a first name, a last name, and a date of birth, now this button should be enabled. And when I click on this create a username button, it is showing that username based on first name, last name, and date of birth. So this requirement is also done. Now finally, instead of logging the generated username in the console, we want to populate this username form control with that automatically generated username. Let's see how we can do that. Let's go back to VS Code again, and let's go to app component.ts. And in this method, inside this generate username method, after we have calculated the username, instead of logging it in the console, what we want to do is we want to populate the username form control. For that, what we can do is on the reactive form. So for that, we can access this reactive form property, and on that we can call setValue method. And to this setValue method, we need to pass an object. And as we learned earlier, this object structure must match the object structure of the form control, form group, or form array on which we are using it. Currently, we are using it on this reactive form group. So the object which we are passing here, its structure must match the structure of that form group. So basically, it must match this structure. So here we have an object. So the structure of the object which we are passing to the setValue method, it must match the structure of this object. That object must have these properties. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll copy all these properties from here, and let me go ahead and let me paste it inside this object which we are passing to this setValue. And instead of assigning it a form control, we are going to set its value to empty string. Let's do the same thing for other form controls. And here to this address, we need to assign an object. Okay, and in that object, let's set the value for street, country, city, region, and postal code. And let's remove this closing parenthesis. In the same way, for this skills, let's assign it with an array, because this skills is a form array. So for the form group, for this address property, which is a form group, we assign an object. For the skills, which is a form array, we are going to assign an array. And in that array, let's say we are going to have only one skill, and I'm going to set the value for that skill to empty string. In the same way, for this experience, we are going to assign an array, and this array, it is going to be an empty array. And let's include this closing curly brace and also this parenthesis. All right. So this is the same structure which we have specified for this reactive form group. Now here we want to set the username, and we want to set this username with this username value. So let's go ahead and let's assign it here. With this, let's save the changes and let's see if it works or not. So let's go back to our web application. In the form, let's enter first name, let's say John, last name Smith, and let's select a date of birth. Okay, let me clear the console here. And when I click on this create a username button, you will notice that this username form control has been populated with the generated username. Okay, but other fields have become empty. That's because when we are going to click on this create a username button, inside that we are calling this setValue method. So this setValue method is going to set the value for each of the form controls as empty string, as you can see. It will only update the username with the generated username value, but all other form controls we are setting it to empty string. But we don't want to do that, right? So here, instead of setting it to empty string, what we are going to do is we are going to access each of the form controls. We are going to read its value and we are going to assign it to these properties. So for example, to this first name, we want to assign the value which the user has entered inside the first name form control. For that, again, we need to access the reactive form property. On that, we are going to use the get method. There, we are going to specify the property name, which is first name. So this first name is basically this form control name. Okay, so we are accessing that first name form control using its property name. So this is going to return us the first name form control. On that, we are going to access its value property. Let's go ahead and let's do the same thing for other properties as well. Now, we are not going to change the username because this username we want to update with this username value. So we are not going to read the value of username form control and set that value to this username. Okay, so this is the one field which you wanted to update, but for the other fields, the value should be same which the user has entered in those form controls. Now for the address, inside this address, we have this street property. So here, instead of saying simply street, we don't have any property called street in this form group. So in this reactive form, we don't have any property called street. Instead, we have this address property, and inside that address property, we have the street property. So in order to access this street property, what we need to do is we need to say address dot street. Okay, and then we need to access its value. Let's do the same thing for country, city, region, and postal code. Then for the skills, again, we are going to read the skills property. So here we will say skills, and that form control, it is going to store an array, and we want to assign that array to this skills property. And experience also, we are going to do the same thing. So here we'll pass the property name as experience. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now if I specify the first name, last name, and if I select the date of birth, and now when I click on this create a username button, it is calculating the username, but it is not making these fields empty. So now we don't have any error, any validation error. So it is working as expected. Now let's see one more thing. So we have learned that we can use this setValue method on a form group, form array, or form control. So now instead of accessing this setValue method on this form group, let's try to simply access it on the form control, on the username form control. So let me comment this expression here, and let's get access to the username form control. For that, let's first access this reactive form. On that, let's use this get method. Let's pass the control name, which is username, and on this, let's try to use setValue method. And as we learned, to the setValue method, we need to pass the structure of the form group, form array, or form control on which we are using it. So for the username, the structure is simple. It is just a primitive value. So instead of passing an object, here we will simply pass the value which we want to update. So for example, when we used it on the reactive form, This reactive form, it is a form group, and to that form group we pass an object. But this username, it is simply a form control, and the value property of this form control, it is not going to contain any object or an array. It is simply going to contain a value. So that's why instead of passing an object here, we are going to pass the value which we want to set for this username form control, and that value we have inside the username variable. Let's see if it works or not. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page and let's enter first name, last name, and let's also enter the date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you see it is still populating that username form control. So you can also call this setValue method on a form control itself instead of calling it on a form group. Now you can use this setValue method on a form group when you want to update multiple fields. But if you want to update only a single field, then calling this setValue method on the form control itself should be okay. Alright, so this was about setValue method. Here we learned how to use a setValue method on a form group and also on a form control. But we can also use a setValue method on a form array. Now let's see how we can update a form group using patchValue method. So the patchValue method is also used to update a subset of the element of form group or form array. And keep in mind that it is only going to update the matching objects and ignore the rest. So let's see how we can use patchValue method. So again, on the reactive form group, we are going to call patchValue method. Now if you remember, when we were using this patchValue method on a template driven form, there on the form object we were also calling form property, and on that form property we were accessing this patchValue method. But here we can access this patchValue method directly on the form group, and to this we need to pass an object, and inside this object we need to specify the structure of the property which we want to update. We want to update the username property here, right? So we simply need to pass username, and there we need to specify what value do we want to update for that username. So here to this username property we want to assign the value stored in the username variable. So the value which we have calculated here. Okay, and that should be it. If I save the changes, if you go back to the web page, let's enter first name, last name, and the date of birth. And when I click on this create a username button, you see it is calculating the username, and it is also not setting other values to empty string. So it is working as expected. So if you want to update a form group, in that case, using this patch value is better approach, because here you don't need to specify the complete structure of the form group, right? But when we were using this set value method on the form group, in that case to that form group we needed to pass the complete structure of that form group, even if we were updating only one field. So this is the advantage of using patch value over set value. Now if you want to update, let's say in this form group, if you want to update, let's say this city field, then you will have to specify the complete structure of the city field. For example, this city property is present inside this address property, right? So the object which we are passing to this patch value method, let's say we also want to update the city property. So the structure of that city property will be, first we need to specify the address property, because that city property is present inside address property. This address property, it is an object, and in that object we have the city property. And to this city property now we can specify a value which we want to update. For example, let's say we want to update it to Delhi, or maybe New Delhi. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let's enter first name and last name. Let's also select a date of birth. All right. And now when I click on this create a username button, it is going to generate a username, and it is going to populate this username form control with that username. And it is also going to update this city form control with New Delhi. So when I click on this create a username button, you see this form control is updated with the value New Delhi, and the username is also generated and populated in the username form control. So this is how we can use patch value method. So we use setValue and patchValue method to update a form control in a form. And setValue and patchValue method can be used on a form control, on a form group, or a form array. Here we are using this patchValue method on a form group, but we can also use it on a form array and a form control. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day. In the final lecture of this section, let's learn how we can retrieve form data from the reactive form and also how to reset a form after the form is submitted. So in this reactive form, if we go ahead and if we enter some data in each of the form controls, and now if I go ahead and if I submit this form, you'll see that this form group object has been logged here. And in this form group object, we have this value property. And in this value property, for each of these form controls, a property has been created. And to that property, the value which we have entered in each of these form controls has been assigned. For example, in the first name, we have entered John. So here also you can see to this first name property, John is assigned. In the same way, in the email, we have entered this email address. So that same email address has been assigned to this email property. And if I expand this address property here, in there we have other properties like city, country, postal, region, and street. So whatever value we have entered in the address form controls, like in the street address, country, city, region, and postal code, those values have been assigned to these properties. So if we want to read the value of all the form controls of this reactive form, we can make use of this value property of this form group. So let's go to VS Code. And when the form is submitted, we want to read the value of each of the form controls. So let's go to the submit method. So here we have the onForm submitted method. There we are logging the reactive form object, this form group. But instead of logging this form group, what we want is we want to read its value property and we want to log it in the console. So here we will simply say this dot reactive form dot value, and it will return us the value object of that reactive form group. If I save the changes now, if we go to the web page, and again, if we enter some details in these fields, and when I click on the submit button, you will notice that an object has been logged here. And in that object, we have the address property. In that address property, we have city, country, postal, region, and street property. We have this date of birth property, email, experience, first name, gender, last name, skills, and username property. So when we are logging the value object of the form group, it is logging this object. And we can make use of this object to read the value of each of these form controls using its form control name. So now what we want is, currently we are entering the details, but we are not showing these details which the user has entered in the web page. So after this form, we want to show the details which the user has entered in this form. For that, let's go back to VS Code. Let's go to appcomponent.html. And after this form, we are going to write some HTML to display the details which the user has entered in the form. And in order to save some time, I have already written that HTML. So let me grab it from here and let's paste it here. Now currently we have these values hard coded. So this email is hard coded, this username is hard coded, this date of birth is hard coded. But what we want is we want to set these values from the form data which the user has entered in the form. So in the app component.ts, we are going to create a property. Let's call it maybe form data. It is going to be an object of type any. And initially, let's assign it with an empty object. So the object with no properties. And once the submit button is clicked, we want to assign this property, this form data property, with the value object of the form group. So here we will say this dot form data equals this dot reactive form dot value, and it is going to return us the value object, and we are assigning this value object to this form data. Now we can make use of this form data property in the HTML. So here we want to show the user full name. So here we want to show the user first name and last name. So here we will use string interpolation syntax, and there we will say form data, and in this form data we will have a first name property. In the same way, in this form data, we will also have a last name property. So let's add a space, and after that, on this form data, let's also access the last name property. Then here we want to display the email. So in the form data, we are also going to have the email property. Then here we want to display the username. So in the form data object, we will have a property username. Then here we want to display the date of birth. So from the form data, we are going to access its DOB property, and it will return us the date of birth which the user has selected in the form. Then here we want to show the country. So we will access the country property on that form data. Here we want to show city. So we will access the city property on that form data. And remember that this form data, it is going to return us the value object. And this country property, it is present in the address property of that value object, right? So here we cannot access this country property directly. So if I go to appcomponent.ts, there the structure of the value object will be similar to this object which we are passing to this form group. And in that structure, we don't have a country property. We have this address property, and in that address property, we have this country, city, region, and postal code property, and the street property. So we cannot access this country property directly. We need to access it on the address property. So here we will say form data dot address dot country, and here also we will say form data dot address dot city. Then here we want to show the region. So again, that region is present inside this address property. In the address property, we have a property called region. And in the same way, here we want to show the postal code. So again, in the address property, we have the postal property. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And currently, you will see there is no data displayed here. But let's go ahead and let's enter some data. And here it says cannot read property of undefined. That's because initially when this page loads, this form data here, it is an empty object. It does not have an address property, right? But here in the HTML, we are trying to access this country property on that address property. But initially when the page loads, there is no address property in this form data. So this expression here, it is going to return undefined. And on that undefined, we are trying to access the country property. So initially when the page loads, what we will do is here we will use the optional chaining operator. So if this expression returns undefined, then we will not try to access the country property. Only if this address property returns something, then only we will try to access this country property. Okay, so here let's use that optional chaining operator. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now there is no error. We don't see any data here. Now let's go ahead and let's enter some data in these fields. And let's clear the console here. And let's scroll down and let's click on this submit button. And now you will notice that that data is being displayed here. Now in this avatar image also, we want to show the first letter from the first name and the first letter from the last name. So let's also do that. And doing that is very simple. So here we are displaying the avatar name. So here first we want to get the first letter from the first name. For that we can say form data dot first name, and on that I'm going to use the slice method. And to this slice method, we need to pass two arguments. So the first argument will be the starting index from where we want to extract the characters. So we want to extract the characters from index 0 because we want to extract the first character from the first name. And we want to extract only one character. So the second argument will be 1. So this will return us the first character from the first name. In the same way, we also want to extract the first character from the last name. So here on the form data, we will access the last name. And on that, we are using the slice method to extract its first character. All right, so this is how you can extract the first character from the first name and last name. And those two characters will be displayed in this avatar. So currently you see, since we have not entered any data, nothing is being displayed here. And again, we have this error because initially when the page loads, this form data will be an empty object. There will not be any first name property there. So again, here also let's use optional chaining operator. Let's save the changes again. Let's go back to the web page. Let's fill the required fields. And now let's go ahead and let's submit this form. So let me first clear the console. Let's submit the form. And now you will see all the data which we have entered in this form. And you'll also see the first character from the first name and the first character from the last name. So this is how we can read form data from a reactive form. We can read form data using the value property of that form group object, like we are doing here. Now what we also want is, when the form is submitted, after that we want to reset this form. So we want to make all these form controls go to its previous state, and all these form controls should be empty. Doing that is again very simple. We need to use the reset method on the form group. So again, here we can say this dot reactive form, and on that we can call the reset method, and it will simply reset the form. And when I say it will reset the form, it will make all the form controls empty, and it is also going to set the state of each form controls to their initial state. So again, let's go ahead and let's enter some details in this form controls. Let me clear the console. Let's scroll down, and now you will notice that as soon as I submit the form, the state of each of these form controls will change. So for example, let's see the current state of this first name form control. So here we have our form. In this form, here we have this columns, and in this columns we have this first name form control. So currently on this first name form control, this ng dirty, ng valid, and ng touched css class has been added. So this is the current state of this first name form control. Now as soon as I submit this form, the details have been displayed here, and you will notice that all these form controls have become empty. And you will also see that on the first name form control, so here we have that input element, this first name input element, there you will notice that the state has also changed. So now it has this state ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng invalid. So this is the initial state of this form control when this form gets rendered for the first time. And same will be true for all other form controls. So this reset method, this not only sets each form control to empty, but it also resets the state of each form control and hence the form group. Now you'll also notice that when we have reset the form, there is no default gender selected and there is no default country selected. But what we want is, even if the form is reset, it should have a default value of gender as male and the default value for country as India. So to this reset method, we can again pass an object, and that object structure must match the object structure which we are passing to this form group. Okay, so this structure, and then we can set default value for some of the properties. For example, let me copy each property from here, and let's pass it to the reset method here. And there, for all the properties, we want to set its value to null. So let me quickly do that. Okay, to this reset method, we are passing an object, and the structure of that object must match the structure of the object which we are passing to the reactive form group. And there, when the form is getting reset, we are setting the initial value of each of the form controls to null, like we were doing when we were creating this form. So that time also, for each of these form controls, we have set its initial value to null. So the same thing we are doing here as well. But here we also want to set a default value for gender, and the default value for gender we want to set it to male. In the same way, we also want to set a default value for country as India. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Okay, now let me go ahead and let me again enter some data in this form. And let me go ahead and let me submit this form. So as soon as I submit the form, you can see the details which we have entered in the form, and the form is also reset. And when the form is reset, now you can see there is a default value for gender, which is male, and a default value for country, which is India. Rest other form controls are empty now. So using this reset method, You can also set a default value for some of the fields, like we are doing here for gender and country. All right, so this is all about reactive forms in Angular. In this section, we learned about reactive forms in great detail. We learned how to create a reactive form, how to validate a reactive form, how to retrieve value from a reactive form, and many more things. And I have covered most of the topics in this section with a real world example so that you can understand how we can use each feature of a reactive form in a real world project. If you have any questions related to reactive form, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.